Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I checked my watch as Trevor and I reached the fourth switchback on the Kolchak Lake Trail, 10:17 a.m. We'd made good time since starting out at dawn from the Stewart Lake trailhead. The morning air still held some coolness, but the July sun was quickly burning it away. My pack dug into my shoulders as I adjusted the weight. "You holding up okay, Dan?" Trevor called back to me, his lanky frame a few yards ahead on the path. "Doing fine," I replied, taking a swig from my canteen. "Should hit Kolchak in another hour if we keep this pace." Trevor nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. We'd been planning this trip for months. A multi-day hike through the enchantments, one of the most beautiful and challenging wilderness areas in Washington's Cascade Mountains. It was the summer of '76, and both of us had just finished our senior year at Eastern Washington University. This trip was our graduation gift to ourselves before real life kicked in. The trail steepened as we continued climbing. Around us, the forest was alive with sound, birds calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the constant whisper of wind through pine needles. We'd encountered a couple of other hikers earlier that morning, but they were heading back down after an overnight stay at Kolchak. Now we had the trail to ourselves. By noon, we reached Kolchak Lake. Its waters a startling turquoise against the rugged mountain backdrop. Across the lake loomed Dragon Tail Peak and Asgard Pass, our next destination. The pass was a brutal climb, gaining nearly 2,000 feet of elevation in less than a mile. We paused to eat some trail mix and jerky, resting on sun-warmed rocks at the lake's edge. "Think we should camp here tonight and tackle the pass in the morning?" Trevor asked, squinting up at the imposing slope. I shook my head. "Weather report said clear skies through tomorrow. I say we push on while we've got daylight. Make camp up in the enchantments proper." Trevor grinned. "Glutton for punishment. All right, let's do it." After refilling our canteens, we circled around the lake to the base of Asgard Pass. The climb was every bit as grueling as I'd expected. No proper trail existed here. Just a steep scramble over loose rock and scree. Every step required concentration. My calves burned with the effort, and sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool mountain air. Trevor pushed ahead, his longer legs giving him an advantage on the steep terrain. 2 hours into the climb, we were about 2/3 of the way up when Trevor called back to me. "Dan, there's a water source up here. Let's take 5. I followed his voice and found him seated on a flat rock beside a small spring that trickled out from the mountainside, forming a clear pool before continuing downslope. The spot was relatively level, a small shelf in the otherwise steep terrain. Behind us, the view of Kolchak Lake was spectacular, the water now looking impossibly far below. "Man, I needed this," I sighed, dropping my pack and rolling my shoulders. I knelt and splashed cold water on my face, then refilled my nearly empty canteen. Trevor pulled out his topo map. "According to this, we're just below what they call the Lost World Plateau. Once we're over the pass, we'll hit the first of the enchantment lakes." I nodded, leaning back against my pack and stretching my legs. The stillness up here was profound. No sounds except the trickle of water and the occasional cry of a hawk riding thermals high above. That's when I noticed movement on the opposite side of the small ravine where our spring emerged. "Trevor," I said quietly, pointing. "Bear." About 100 yards away, something large and brown moved among the sparse trees that managed to grow at this elevation. Trevor squinted, then reached into his pack for his binoculars. "Doesn't move quite like a bear," he murmured, adjusting the focus. "It's—" He trailed off, his body suddenly tensing. I watched as the color drained from his face. "What? What is it?" I hissed, keeping my voice down. Without a word, Trevor handed me the binoculars, his hand visibly shaking. I raised them to my eyes and found the brown shape. What I saw sent a cold shock through my entire body. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. The creature stood upright on two legs, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick brown hair or fur. It was moving along the rocky slope with surprising agility, using its long arms to pull itself up difficult sections. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know." Trevor's voice was barely audible. "But it's not human, and it's not a bear." Through the binoculars, I could make out details that made my skin crawl. Its movements were too deliberate, too calculated. It placed its hands, not paws, but hands, carefully on rocks for support as it climbed. Its posture was unsettlingly human-like, yet everything else about it was wrong. The proportions, the massive bulk, the way it moved with a strength that seemed impossible. "Should we move?" Trevor whispered. "Try to get away before it sees us." I shook my head slightly. No sudden movements. We don't know how it might react. We sat frozen, watching as the creature continued its climb. It reached a small plateau about 50 yards above its starting point, then stopped. For a heart-stopping moment, it turned its head in our direction. Then it did something that cemented this as the most terrifying experience of my life. It turned its body sideways to face us directly, adjusting its stance with deliberate, conscious movements. Then it looked down at us, not with the casual glance of an animal sensing other creatures nearby, but with focused attention. I couldn't make out its facial features clearly at that distance, even with the binoculars, but I could feel its gaze lock onto us. A strange sensation washed over me, a certainty that this thing was not just aware of us, but was communicating something. "It knows we're here," Trevor whispered. "It's watching us." "Yeah," I managed to say, my mouth bone dry. The creature remained still for several long seconds, its gaze fixed on us. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, it turned away, continuing its journey upward. It paused at the spring that fed our water source, knelt down, and in a gesture so human it made my stomach turn, cupped water in its hands to drink. After drinking, it straightened up again to its full height, and walked, not on all fours like a bear, but upright like a man, into the tree line and disappeared from view. Neither of us moved or spoke for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was our ragged breathing and the pounding of blood in my ears. "Did you—" Trevor finally broke the silence, his voice cracking. "Did you feel like it was telling us something?" I finished for him. "Yeah, like it was saying it just wanted a drink, that it wasn't interested in us." Trevor nodded slowly. "Like it was saying, 'I'll stay out of your way, I just need a drink of water.'" "Exactly." We sat in stunned silence for another few minutes, both afraid the creature might return and afraid to move on. "What the hell did we just see, Dan?" Trevor finally asked, his voice steadier now but still tight with fear. That couldn't have been Bigfoot." I said the word neither of us had wanted to voice. "I don't know. I never believed in that stuff." "Me neither. But that wasn't a bear, and it sure as hell wasn't a man in a suit." I nodded, my mind racing to make sense of what we'd witnessed. The way it moved, the way it looked at us. There was intelligence there. "What do we do?" Trevor asked, gathering his pack. "Do we go back down, report it to someone?" I thought about this for a moment. Who would believe us? And even if they did, what then? They'd send hunters up here, researchers, people with guns. Trevor's eyes met mine, and I knew he was thinking the same thing. Whatever we'd seen, it hadn't threatened us. It had acknowledged our presence and moved on, asking only for the same courtesy. We keep going, I decided. We stick to our plan, but we stay alert. Trevor nodded slowly. Okay. We gathered our things, both of us checking and double-checking the surrounding area before shouldering our packs. The rest of the climb up Asgard Pass was tense, each of us constantly scanning for movement, starting at every sound. The sun was beginning its descent when we finally crested the pass and beheld the lower enchantment basin spread before us. Under normal circumstances, the sight would have taken my breath away. Crystal clear lakes nestled among stark white granite, scattered larches preparing for their famous fall golden display, and the rugged peaks surrounding the basin like ancient guardians. But all I could think about was what else might be watching from those peaks. We made camp near Isolation Lake, picking a spot with good visibility in all directions. Neither of us mentioned the creature as we set up our tent and prepared a simple dinner, but it dominated my thoughts. By unspoken agreement, we built our fire larger than usual, though the July evening wasn't particularly cold. "You think there are more of them?" Trevor finally asked as we sat by the fire, darkness settling over the mountains. "I don't know," I admitted. "Logic says there must be, right? Nothing exists as just one." "Yeah." Trevor poked at the fire with a stick. "You know what's weird? I'm scared out of my mind, but I also feel, I don't know, privileged? Like we saw something most people go their whole lives never knowing exists." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. It was terrifying, but also amazing. "Do you think it lives up here year-round? These mountains get buried in snow all winter." I shrugged. "Maybe it migrates. Or maybe they have shelters somewhere, if they're as intelligent as that one seemed." We speculated late into the night, our initial terror gradually giving way to a kind of awed curiosity. But when we finally crawled into our tent, I made sure our packs, with all our food properly stored in bear canisters, were a good distance from our sleeping area. Better safe than sorry. I slept fitfully, waking at every sound: the crack of a branch, the call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through trees. Each time I'd lie still, listening intently for footsteps, for breathing, for any sign we weren't alone. Dawn came with a relief I'd never felt before. We breakfasted quickly and discussed our plans for the day. "We could still turn back," Trevor suggested, though I could tell his heart wasn't in it. "And miss the rest of the enchantments? After how hard it was to get permits?" I shook my head. "Besides, I think if they wanted to hurt us, they would have done it by now." Trevor nodded. "You're right. Let's stick to the plan. 3 more days up here, then out via the Snow Lakes Trail." We packed up camp and continued our journey through the Enchantment Lakes basin, hiking from one pristine alpine lake to the next. The beauty of the landscape should have been all-consuming, but I couldn't help scanning the tree line, the rocky outcroppings, the shadows between boulders. Every so often I'd feel a prickle on the back of my neck, a sensation of being watched that I couldn't shake. That night, camped near Crystal Lake, Trevor voiced what I'd been feeling all day. "They're watching us," he said quietly as we sat by our fire. "I can feel it." I nodded. "I felt it too. Not threatening," he clarified, "just observing. Like we're in their territory and they're making sure we behave ourselves." "Exactly." We didn't see the creature or any others like it for the remainder of our trip, but the feeling of being observed never fully dissipated. By our final day, it had become almost comfortable, like having silent, hidden trail companions keeping tabs on us from a respectful distance. As we descended the Snow Lakes Trail on our last day, the sensation gradually faded. By the time we reached the trailhead and the parking lot where we'd left Trevor's old Ford pickup, it was gone completely. We drove back to Leavenworth in silence, both lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we stopped for dinner at a small diner that Trevor broached the subject again. "We're not going to tell anyone, are we?" he asked, stirring his coffee. I shook my head. Who'd believe us? And even if they did, they'd go looking, Trevor finished, with cameras or guns or both. Yeah. I took a bite of my burger, chewing thoughtfully. It feels wrong somehow, like betraying a confidence. I know what you mean, like we were allowed to see something special, and there's a responsibility that comes with that. We fell silent again, the weight of our shared secret settling between us. That night, staying in a cheap motel before heading back to our respective homes the next day, I dreamed of mountains and watchful eyes. In the dream, I was hiking alone through pine forests, and though I never saw the creatures, I knew they were there, moving parallel to my path, neither threatening nor retreating, simply coexisting in a world that had somehow expanded to include both our kinds. In the years that followed, Trevor and I returned to the enchantment several times. We never again had a direct sighting like that first encounter at Asgard Pass, but sometimes, in the silence of the alpine wilderness, we'd feel that familiar sensation of being watched. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, we'd catch what might have been the sound of movement in the underbrush, too deliberate to be a deer, too careful to be a bear. We never told anyone about what we saw that summer day in 1976. Some secrets, we decided, the mountains keep for themselves, and some revelations are too profound, too sacred almost, to share with a world that might not understand the importance of letting some mysteries remain unsolved, some beings undisturbed. But I know what I saw. And on still nights, when the wind whispers through trees outside my window, I sometimes think of that creature's gaze, intelligent, aware, communicating across the gulf that separates our species. And I wonder if, somewhere in the remote wilderness of the Cascades, it sometimes remembers the two hikers who shared a moment of silent understanding at a mountain spring, before each continuing on their separate ways. Story 2. I gripped the handlebars of my dirt bike, feeling the engine vibrate beneath me as I tore down the fire trail. The late afternoon sun sliced through the trees in golden shafts, dappling the ground ahead. I was 12 that summer, and nothing beat the rush of flying through the woods with my cousin Ethan. At 14, he was bigger, stronger, and his bike was faster, but I knew these trails like the back of my hand. "Keep up, Jason!" Ethan shouted over his shoulder, his voice nearly lost in the growl of his engine and the wind rushing past my ears. We'd been riding for almost 2 hours through the south hills of Eugene. These woods stretched from the mountains all the way to the Oregon coast, a vast playground of pine and fir that my grandfather knew better than anyone. He was the park and recreation director, and he'd taught us everything about these trails, which ones were safe, which ones washed out after heavy rain, and which ones to avoid after dark. I twisted the throttle harder, the back wheel of my bike spitting dirt as I gained on Ethan. We rounded a bend in the trail, heading deeper into a section we rarely explored. The trees grew thicker here, crowding the narrow path and blocking out more of the sunlight. The temperature dropped a few degrees, and I felt goosebumps rise on my arms despite the sweat beading on my forehead. That's when it hit me. The smell. I nearly gagged, easing off the throttle automatically. It was like something had crawled into my nostrils and died. Rotting meat, stagnant water, and something else, something wild and musky that I couldn't place. Ahead of me, Ethan's brake light flashed red as he slowed down too. He turned his head, and I could see his nose wrinkled in disgust, even behind his helmet visor. "You smell that?" he called back, his voice muffled. I nodded, pulling up alongside him as we both came to a stop, engines idling. "What is it? Dead deer, maybe?" Ethan shook his head, lifting his visor. "Too strong. Man, that reeks." I scanned the woods around us, looking for the source. The smell seemed to be coming from a particularly dense patch of brush and trees off to our right, maybe 20 feet from the trail. The undergrowth was thick there, tangled with blackberry vines and ferns. "Should we check it out?" I asked, not sure if I really wanted to. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring past me, his eyes wide, his mouth hanging open slightly. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed. I turned my head, following his gaze, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still, was something that shouldn't exist. It was small, maybe 4 feet tall, and stood upright on 2 legs. Its body was covered in thick, dark brown hair that hung in matted clumps like dreadlocks 6 to 8 inches long. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in my veins. Large, round, and unnaturally bright, they stared at us without blinking, without emotion. Not animal eyes, not human eyes either, something in between. "Ethan," I whispered, my mouth bone dry. "What is that?" "I don't know," he whispered back. His hand moved slowly to the ignition key of his bike, as if he was afraid any sudden movement would set the creature off. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a deer or a bear cub. Bears don't stand upright like that. Not so still, not so purposeful. This thing was watching us, studying us, and I had the horrible feeling it was thinking. Neither of us moved. The creature didn't move. The only sounds were the soft idling of our engines and the distant call of a crow somewhere above the canopy. 1 minute passed, then 2. The thing didn't blink, didn't twitch. It was as if it believed that by standing perfectly still, it was invisible to us. But we saw it. God, did we see it? Then, from deeper in the woods behind the creature, came a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. A loud grunt, deep, guttural, and powerful. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard before. It was almost like someone trying to clear their throat, but louder, raw. The small creature's head snapped around toward the sound. In that instant, it seemed to forget about us completely. It turned and bolted into the thick forest, moving with surprising speed, its strange body disappearing into the undergrowth in seconds. "Holy shit," Ethan breathed. "Did you see that? Did you freaking see that?" I nodded, unable to speak. My heart was hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. "We should follow it," Ethan said, revving his engine slightly. "Are you crazy?" I finally found my voice. "No way. The woods are too thick for the bikes. And whatever made that grunt sound. But what if it's Bigfoot?" I cut him off. "It's got to be. Remember Grandpa's stories about the sightings up in Washington?" Ethan's eyes widened. "You think that was a baby Bigfoot? And the grunt was—" "The parent," I finished for him. "The adult, and it's still out there." We both turned to look back at the spot where the small creature had vanished. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, hiding who knows what. That grunt still echoed in my ears, and I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. "Let's get out of here," I said, and Ethan didn't argue. We kicked our bikes into gear and spun them around, heading back the way we'd come. I don't think either of us had ever ridden so fast down those trails. Every shadow in the trees looked like a lurking figure. Every breaking twig sounded like footsteps close behind us. By the time we burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road that led back to my house, the sun was starting to set. We slowed our bikes, both of us breathing hard, though not from exertion. "Should we tell someone?" Ethan asked as we coasted down the road. The normal sounds of civilization. Distant cars, someone's radio playing, a dog barking, never sounding so good. I thought about it for a moment. Who would believe us? They'd just say it was a bear cub or something. "But it wasn't," Ethan insisted. "You saw it. It was standing upright. And those eyes—" "I know," I said, "but still." We decided to tell Grandpa. If anyone would believe us, it would be him. He'd been telling stories about Bigfoot sightings for years, though always with a wink and a smile, like maybe he was just pulling our legs. But after what we'd seen, I wondered if those stories weren't more real than he let on. We found Grandpa on the back porch, nursing a beer and watching the sunset. He listened to our story without interrupting, his weathered face giving nothing away. When we finished, he took a long pull from his bottle and set it down carefully on the arm of his chair. "You boys sure about what you saw?" he asked, his voice steady. "Yes, sir," Ethan and I said in unison. Grandpa nodded slowly. "That stretch of woods in the South Hills? There've been stories about it for years, not just Bigfoot, strange lights, odd sounds at night. Most folks around here know to leave well enough alone." "So you believe us?" I asked, surprised. "I believe you saw something," he replied carefully, "something you can't explain. And I believe that sometimes it's best not to try too hard to explain it." "But what was it?" Ethan pressed. Grandpa shrugged. "Some things the woods keep to themselves. That's why they're still wild, even with all our trails and maps and ranges. The forest has secrets." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but somehow it felt right. The forest had secrets, and today we'd stumbled upon one of them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those unblinking eyes staring back at me. I heard that grunt in the darkness of my room. I smelled that awful rotten odor. The next morning, Ethan and I debated going back. Part of me wanted to prove to myself that what we'd seen was real, to maybe catch a glimpse of the creature again, maybe even get a picture this time. But a stronger part of me, the part that remembered the sound of that grunt and imagined what might have made it, kept me away. Days passed, then weeks. School started up again, and the encounter in the woods became something we talked about less and less, at least to other people. Between us, though, it was a bond, a secret we shared that set us apart from everyone else we knew. I still went into those woods. I couldn't stay away. I went camping with my dad, fishing in the streams, four-wheeling on the wider trails. But I never went back to that specific spot, that thick patch of brush and trees where we'd encountered the creature. Something told me it was best to leave that place undisturbed. Years passed. I grew up, went to high school, then college. Ethan moved away after graduation, heading to Seattle for work. We stayed in touch, but our conversations rarely turned to that day in the South Hills. Not because we'd forgotten, I know I never would, but because what was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist but did. Words couldn't capture what that felt like. I'm 28 now. I still live in Eugene, still spend time in those woods when I can. I've hiked every trail, fished every stream, camped in clearings under stars so bright they hurt your eyes. In all that time, I've never again seen anything like the creature from that day. But I've never forgotten that smell, that distinctive, awful odor of rot and wildness. I know I would recognize it instantly if I ever encountered it again. Sometimes, when the wind shifts just right in certain parts of the forest, I catch a hint of something on the breeze that makes me freeze in my tracks, makes my heart skip a beat, but it's always gone before I can be sure. Last summer, I was hiking alone on a trail I'd never explored before, several miles from where Ethan and I had our encounter. It was getting late, the sun already dipping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the path. I should have turned back, should have headed for my car while there was still light, but something kept pulling me forward. The trail narrowed, the trees pressing closer on either side. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the bird sounds that had accompanied me all day suddenly went silent. That's when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. I stopped, scanning the woods around me. Nothing moved, no birds, no squirrels, nothing, just still, silent forest stretching in every direction. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, examining each tree, each shadow, each patch of undergrowth. And then I caught it, just the faintest whiff of that smell, that unmistakable, unforgettable odor. It was distant, barely there, but I knew what it was instantly. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared into the gathering darkness between the trees. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I knew. Whatever we'd encountered all those years ago, it was still out there, still watching, still keeping the secrets of these woods. I backed away slowly, then turned and hiked out faster than I'd ever moved before. I didn't run. Something told me running would be a mistake, but I walked with purpose, with urgency, never looking back until I reached my car. I haven't told anyone about that day, not even Ethan. Some experiences can't be shared, can't be explained. They live inside you, changing how you see the world, how you move through it. The South Hills of Eugene hold many secrets. I discovered one of them when I was 12 years old, and it's been with me ever since. I don't know what Ethan and I saw that day. A juvenile Sasquatch, some unknown species, something else entirely. But I know it was real. As real as the trees, as real as the dirt beneath our tires, as real as the fear that still rises in my throat whenever I remember those unblinking eyes staring back at me. And I know this: there are things in this world we don't understand, things that exist whether we believe in them or not, things that watch us from the shadows, from the spaces between the trees, from the wild places we've yet to tame. I still go into those woods. I always will. But now I go with the knowledge that I'm never truly alone there, that the forest has eyes, that sometimes, when I feel watched, it's because I am. And that's a secret I'll carry with me always, like the smell of rot and wildness that I know I'll never forget. Story 3. My name is Melissa Bennett, and I was 11 years old when it happened. Summer of 1975. The kind of summer that sticks to your skin and never really leaves your memory. Our family was heading back to Tacoma after 3 days of camping. Dad was driving our old camper truck with Mom in the passenger seat. My 4-year-old brother Tommy and 6-year-old sister Jenny were getting restless from the long drive. Me and my older sister Rebecca, she was 17 then, were crammed in the back, sweaty and tired of Tommy's whining. "Pull over," Mom said suddenly. "Tommy needs to stretch his legs before he drives us all crazy." Dad grunted and turned the wheel, guiding our camper onto a narrow dirt road that cut through the dense trees of Fort Lewis Army Reservation. The tires crunched over pine needles and small rocks as we rolled to a stop in a small clearing. It was about 7 p.m., still light out, but the sun was getting lower, casting long shadows between the trees. 15 minutes, Dad announced, shutting off the engine. "Then we're back on the road." We all piled out of the camper. The air smelled like pine and dirt. Tommy immediately started running in circles, while Jenny stuck close to Mom. Dad stretched his arms over his head and lit a cigarette. "Look at this!" Jenny suddenly squealed, pointing at something on the ground near the edge of the clearing. "Ants!" Mom, Dad, and the little ones wandered over to what turned out to be a massive anthill. I could hear Dad explaining how ant colonies worked, while Tommy tried poking it with a stick. Rebecca nudged my arm. "I need to pee," she whispered. "Come with me?" I nodded. We always stuck together when we needed to go in the woods. "Safety in numbers," Mom always said. We walked away from the camper, heading deeper into the trees where we'd have some privacy. The forest was thick here, tall pines and firs creating a canopy overhead. The ground was soft, with decades of fallen needles. "Far enough," Rebecca said when we were about 50 yards from the camper, still within earshot but hidden from view. "Turn around." I faced away while she did her business, and then we switched. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional bird call and the distant sound of Tommy's high-pitched laughter. After we finished, we started heading back toward the clearing. That's when it happened. We'd only taken a few steps when a strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't exactly fear, not yet. It was something else, like when you know someone's staring at you before you actually catch them doing it. The tiny hairs on my arms stood up. Rebecca and I stopped at the exact same moment. We looked at each other, and I knew she felt it too. "Someone's watching us," she whispered. Without saying another word, we both turned around at the same time. There it was. 15 feet away, partially hidden behind a thick pine tree, stood the tallest creature I'd ever seen. It was leaning against the trunk, one massive arm wrapped around the side, watching us. I couldn't breathe. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I thought it might break them. The creature was huge, 8 or 9 feet tall at least. I knew this because its head reached the lowest branches of the pine tree. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, thick and matted in some places, except for parts of its face. The face, I still see it when I close my eyes. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes were deep-set under a prominent brow, watching us with an intelligence that froze me to the spot. Rebecca's hand found mine and squeezed so tight it hurt. We stood there, locked in place, staring at the creature as it stared back at us. It didn't move toward us. It didn't make a sound. It just watched, its massive chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. Time stretched. It could have been seconds or minutes. I couldn't tell. The world had narrowed down to just us and this impossible creature standing in the woods. Rebecca was the first to move. She tugged at my hand, breaking the spell. "The camera," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dad's camera is on the front seat." We backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the creature. It remained perfectly still, just watching us go. When we reached the edge of the clearing, we turned and walked faster toward the camper. Not running. Somehow I knew running would be bad, but moving with purpose. "Get in the camper and grab the camera," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "I'll keep an eye on it." I scrambled into the camper. Dad's Polaroid was sitting on the driver's seat where he'd left it. My fingers trembled as I grabbed it and climbed back out. Rebecca was standing where I'd left her, her eyes fixed on the spot where we'd seen the creature. I raised the camera, ready to capture proof of what we'd seen. But the creature was gone. "Where did it go?" I whispered, scanning the tree line. "I don't know," Rebecca said. "It was there. And then, it wasn't. It didn't run away. It just disappeared." We stood there for another long moment, staring into the woods, but there was nothing to see, just trees and shadows. "We have to tell Dad," I said, my voice still shaking. We hurried over to where our parents were still examining the anthill with Tommy and Jenny. Dad was crouched down, pointing out the worker ants to Tommy, who had thankfully stopped poking the hill. "Dad," I blurted out, "Dad, we saw something in the woods." He glanced up, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Mel?" "A creature," Rebecca said. "In the woods. It was huge, Dad, like 8 feet tall at least." Dad straightened up, brushing dirt from his knees. "What are you talking about?" "We saw something," I insisted. "It was watching us. It was covered in reddish-brown hair, and it was leaning against a tree, and it was so tall its head reached the branches." Dad looked from me to Rebecca, then back again. He sighed. "You girls been reading those tabloid magazines again? Bigfoot and UFOs and all that nonsense?" "No," Rebecca said. "We really saw it. It was right there, watching us." Mom had wandered over now, holding Jenny's hand. "What's going on?" "The girls think they saw Bigfoot," Dad said with a dismissive chuckle. "We did," I protested. "Dad, please just come look. I grabbed your camera, but it was gone when I got back." Dad shook his head. "We don't have time for this. We need to get back on the road if we want to reach Tacoma before dark." "Just come look," Rebecca pleaded. "It'll only take a minute." But Dad was already herding Tommy toward the camper. "Everybody in. Now." I looked at Rebecca, desperate and frustrated. She put her arm around my shoulders. "He doesn't believe us," I whispered. "I know," she said, "but we know what we saw." We climbed back into the camper. Dad started the engine and pulled back onto the dirt road. I pressed my face against the window, staring at the spot where the creature had been, hoping for one more glimpse. As we drove away, a strange feeling settled over me. Despite the terror of the moment, I realized something. I hadn't felt threatened. The creature had made no move to harm us. It had just watched, like it wanted us to see it, like it was curious about us, the same way we were curious about it. I glanced at Rebecca. "Did you feel scared?" I whispered so our parents couldn't hear. She thought for a moment. "Yes, but not because I thought it would hurt us. It was just so impossible." "It wanted us to see it," I said. "I'm sure of it." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I think you're right." The rest of the drive home was quiet. Tommy fell asleep, and Jenny colored in her book. Mom and Dad talked in low voices in the front seat. Rebecca and I sat in silence, processing what we'd seen. That night, after we got home and unpacked, Rebecca came into my room and sat on my bed. "We can't tell anyone else," she said. "They won't believe us." "I know," I replied. "But it happened, right? We both saw it?" "We both saw it," she confirmed, "and someday we'll find out what it was." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and excitement. The memory of those intelligent eyes watching us from the woods would stay with me forever. 45 years have passed since that summer evening. I'm 56 now, and Rebecca is 62. We've never told anyone else about what we saw in the Fort Lewis woods that day. What would be the point? They'd either think we were lying or crazy. But every few years, Rebecca and I get together and talk about it. The details never change. The height of the creature, the reddish-brown hair, the intelligent eyes, the feeling that it wanted us to see it. Last summer, Rebecca and I took a drive back to Fort Lewis. The area has changed. More development, fewer untouched woods. We couldn't find the exact spot where we'd pulled over all those years ago. Maybe it's gone now, paved over or built upon. But as we stood at the edge of what remains of those woods, I felt it again. That prickle on the back of my neck. That certainty of being watched. "Do you feel that?" Rebecca whispered. I nodded. Yes. We didn't see anything that day. No tall creature with reddish-brown hair. No intelligent eyes watching from between the trees. But I know it's still out there, or others like it, watching, waiting, deciding who gets to see them and who doesn't. I've read the reports over the years, the sightings, the encounters. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Others have different names for it. Scientists dismiss it as myth or misidentification, but Rebecca and I know what we saw. A being that doesn't fit into our understanding of the world. A creature that exists in the shadows between what we know and what we don't. I've often wondered why it let us see it. Why us? Two ordinary girls from Tacoma. What made us special? Maybe we weren't special at all. Maybe we were just in the right place at the right time. Or maybe it was curious about us, the way we were curious about it. I'll never know for sure. But that moment, those few seconds of impossible reality, changed something in me. Made me understand that the world is stranger and more wonderful than we can imagine. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I stop and listen. I turn around quickly, hoping to catch a glimpse of something watching from behind a tree. I never do. But I keep looking. Because once you've seen something impossible, you never stop hoping to see it again. Rebecca and I made a pact years ago. If either of us ever encounters the creature again, we'll find a way to document it. To prove to ourselves and the world that what we saw was real. Until then, we keep the memory alive between us. The tall creature with the reddish-brown hair, the intelligent eyes, the feeling of being watched. And sometimes, when the wind rustles through the trees just right, I could swear I hear something moving out there. Something large and quiet and watchful. Something waiting to be seen. This is Story 4. I jerked awake at exactly 2:03 a.m. according to the digital clock beside my bed. The sound of breaking glass echoed through my partially finished log cabin. I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The cabin was supposed to be my dream home, nestled on 35 acres of pristine wilderness in Camas Valley, Oregon. Right now, it felt like a trap. Reaching for the loaded Remington shotgun I kept beside the bed, I listened for my dogs. Nothing. Complete silence. That wasn't right. My 2 German shepherds, Brutus and Rex, were trained attack dogs. They should have been going crazy, barking their heads off at an intruder. The silence felt more threatening than the sound of glass breaking. I pulled on my boots and grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand, keeping the shotgun aimed forward as I moved through the darkened cabin. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The living area was empty, kitchen clear. I reached the front door and peered through the small window. The porch light illuminated the empty wooden deck, but beyond that was complete darkness. "Brutus! Rex!" I called out softly. No response. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch, the cool night air hitting my face. The forest surrounding my property was pitch black, the tall pines swaying gently in the breeze. I swept my flashlight across the yard, seeing nothing out of place. Then I noticed my truck parked about 50 feet away. The back window was shattered, glass scattered across the ground. Gun raised, I moved cautiously toward the vehicle. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting just enough light to see my path. As I approached the truck, I heard a whimpering sound coming from inside. I aimed my flashlight through the broken window and froze. Brutus and Rex, both 100-pound German shepherds trained to attack on command, were crammed under the back seat of my truck. They were pressed against each other, trembling violently. I'd never seen them like this. These dogs had faced down angry black bears without flinching. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling open the door. "Come on, boys, come out." Neither dog budged. Their eyes were wide with terror, pupils dilated. I reached in and grabbed Brutus by the collar, trying to pull him out. He yelped and resisted, his nails scratching against the floor mat. After a struggle, I managed to drag him out, but he immediately tried to bolt back into the truck. I had to hold him firmly by the collar. "Rex, come!" I ordered sharply. The second dog whimpered but wouldn't move. I had to reach in and physically drag him out too. Once outside, both dogs pressed against my legs, shaking uncontrollably. Something had terrified my attack-trained dogs to the point of paralysis. The realization sent a cold spike of fear down my spine. I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I spotted something on the ground about 10 yards from the truck, a dark shape that didn't belong. Keeping a tight grip on both dogs' collars, I approached slowly. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was one of my goats, Patches, lying motionless on the ground. I'd bought 2 medium-sized goats last month to help clear some of the brush on my property. Patches was completely intact, but absolutely still. I reached down to touch her while holding the flashlight. Her body was still warm, but there was no movement, no breathing. Dead. But where was Billy, the other goat? I saw the chain that I'd used to tether Billy leading away from where Patches lay. Following it with my flashlight, I walked about 15 feet before the beam illuminated something that stopped me cold. Billy's severed head on the ground, eyes wide open in terror, tongue hanging out. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, bile rising in my throat. I swung the flashlight around frantically, looking for the rest of the goat. The chain continued on the ground, covered in blood, but ended in nothing, just a bloody collar. The torso was completely gone. Blood spattered the surrounding dirt and grass in a wide radius. There was a trail of blood droplets leading away from the scene, heading toward the tree line about 100 feet away. My dogs were whining, pulling back toward the cabin. Whatever had done this was potentially still nearby. I wasn't about to follow that blood trail into the woods at night with nothing but a shotgun and a flashlight. I backpedaled toward the cabin, dragging my terrified dogs with me. Once inside, I locked the door and closed all the blinds. I tried calling the county sheriff, but cell service was spotty at best out here. The landline wouldn't be installed until next week. I was on my own until daylight. The dogs refused to leave my side, still trembling. I sat on the couch with the shotgun across my lap until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. Neither of us slept. As soon as it was light enough, I called my neighbor Buck Larson on the radio I kept for emergencies. Buck lived about 4 miles down the mountain and was an experienced hunter. He arrived an hour later with 2 friends, Hank Miller and Jim Dawson. All 3 men carried rifles and brought their hunting dogs, a bloodhound and 2 blue-tick coonhounds. "Show us what happened, Greg," Buck said after I'd explained the situation. His weathered face was serious as he checked the rounds in his rifle. I led the men to the scene. In the daylight, it looked even worse. The blood had dried to a dark, brownish red, and flies buzzed around Billy's severed head. Patch's body lay stiff on the ground, undisturbed from the night before. My dogs refused to leave the porch. "Never seen your dogs act like that," Hank commented, nodding toward the German shepherds cowering back at the cabin. "Those are some hard-ass animals." "They were hiding under the truck seat last night," I said. "Had to drag them out. Never seen them scared of anything before." Jim was examining the blood trail. "Whatever took the goat, it headed that way." He pointed toward the dense forest that bordered my clearing. Buck's bloodhound, Sadie, was the best tracking dog in 3 counties. He brought her over to the blood trail and let her sniff around Billy's severed head. The dog showed interest, but then backed away, whining. "That's odd," Buck muttered, frowning. "Try again, girl." The bloodhound reluctantly approached the scent again, but then tucked her tail and retreated to Buck's side. The 2 coonhounds weren't any better. They circled the area but refused to pick up the trail. "What the hell?" Hank said. "These dogs can track anything." "Let's follow it ourselves," Jim suggested, rifle at the ready. The 4 of us followed the blood trail into the woods. The droplets became scarcer as we went, but still visible on fallen leaves and twigs. About 100 yards in, the trail disappeared completely. "Spread out," Buck instructed. "Look for broken branches, disturbed ground, anything." We searched in a widening circle for hours. The forest was thick with pine and oak, the ground covered in fallen needles and leaves. Perfect tracking conditions, but there was nothing to find. No more blood, no drag marks, no footprints of any kind. It was as if whatever took my goat had simply vanished. Around midday, Hank called out from about 30 yards to my right. "Hey, found something over here." We converged on his position. Hank was standing over what looked like a pile of animal droppings, but it was unlike anything I'd seen before. It was enormous, at least 6 inches tall and 12 inches around, and it was filled with white hair, Billy's hair. Buck knelt down, examining it without touching. "No bear or mountain lion makes scat this size," he said quietly. "And a predator that big would have left tracks." Jim was scanning the forest around us, his knuckles white on his rifle. "You ever hear the stories about these woods, Greg?" "What stories?" I asked. The 3 men exchanged glances. "Folks around here don't talk about it much with outsiders," Buck said carefully. "But there's been sightings over the years. Strange things in these mountains." "Sightings of what?" I pressed. Hank sighed. "Bigfoot. Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. Most people think it's bullshit, but those of us who've spent our lives in these mountains, we know better." I almost laughed, but the dead serious expressions on their faces stopped me. "You're telling me Bigfoot killed my goat and scared my dogs half to death?" "I ain't saying for certain what it was," Buck replied, "but I've been hunting these woods for 40 years, and I've never seen scat like this from any animal I know. And I've never seen trained tracking dogs refuse a scent like this." We continued searching until late afternoon, but found nothing else. No tracks, no more blood, no sign of Billy's body. Eventually, we gave up and headed back to the cabin. "I'm taking Patches to Doc Peterson," I said as we reached the clearing. "Maybe he can tell what killed her." "She doesn't have a mark on her," Jim observed. "That's the strange part." I loaded Patch's body into the back of Buck's truck, and he agreed to drive me to the vet in town. My dogs were still acting strange, refusing to leave the porch and growling at the forest line. Dr. Peterson was just closing his clinic when we arrived, but he agreed to take a look when Buck explained the situation. The old veterinarian examined Patches thoroughly, checking for punctures, breaks, or any sign of trauma. "There's no physical injury I can find," he finally said, looking puzzled. "No poison I can detect either. Based on the dilation of her pupils and the tensed state of her muscles, I'd say this goat died of fright." "Died of fright?" I repeated. "Is that even possible?" "Absolutely," Dr. Peterson nodded. "Extreme terror can cause a surge of adrenaline that leads to heart failure. I've seen it in smaller animals, but rarely in something this size. Whatever scared this goat literally frightened it to death." Back at my property, Buck, Hank, and Jim helped me secure the cabin before they left. We boarded up the broken window in my truck and checked all the locks on the doors and windows of the cabin. "I'd keep those dogs inside with you tonight," Buck advised as they prepared to leave, "and keep that shotgun loaded." "You really think it's what you said?" I asked, still unable to bring myself to say Bigfoot. Buck sighed. "I don't know what it is, Greg, but whatever killed your goat ain't normal. It scared attack dogs into hiding and didn't leave tracks. Normal predators don't do that. After they left, I brought my still nervous dogs inside and double-checked all the locks. I set up a chair facing the windows that looked out toward where I'd found the goats and loaded my shotgun with slugs. The dogs wouldn't leave my side, pressing against my legs as darkness fell. Around midnight, Brutus and Rex suddenly lifted their heads, ears perked forward. A low growl rumbled in Rex's throat as he stared at the window. I gripped my shotgun tighter and listened. At first, there was nothing but the usual forest sounds, the rustle of wind through pine needles, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then I heard it, a heavy footstep on the ground outside. Then another. Something big was walking around my cabin. The dogs began to whimper, backing away from the window. Whatever was out there, it terrified them more than anything I'd ever seen. I moved to the window carefully and peered through a gap in the blinds. The moon was brighter tonight, casting silver light across my clearing. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved between the trees at the edge of the forest. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs. The silhouette was unmistakably humanoid, but too large to be human. As I watched, it stepped partially into the moonlight, and I saw dark, matted hair covering its entire body. My breath caught in my throat. The creature stood motionless, as if sensing it was being watched. Then it turned its head toward the cabin, toward my window. I couldn't make out its features clearly, but I felt its gaze lock with mine across the distance. For several heartbeats, we stared at each other. Then it let out a sound that turned my blood to ice. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between. A sound no human or known animal could make. The dogs pressed themselves against the far wall, trembling violently. The creature turned and moved back into the forest, its massive form disappearing quickly despite its size. I remained frozen at the window for I don't know how long, shotgun clutched in sweaty hands. The next morning, I packed my essential belongings into my truck. I left a note for the construction crew explaining there had been a family emergency. The dogs jumped eagerly into the vehicle, seeming relieved to be leaving. As I drove down the mountain road, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the log cabin, standing half-finished in the clearing. I'd put my life savings into this place, my dream home in the wilderness. I never went back. Some dreams aren't worth dying for. Story 5. I couldn't sleep. The excitement of my first real hunting trip with Dad and his friend Rodney kept my mind racing. At 13, I was finally old enough to join them, and I wanted to prove myself worthy. The thin sleeping bag beneath me did little to cushion the hard wooden floor of the abandoned miner's cabin we'd found, as darkness fell over the forest between Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens. Dad snored softly across the small room. Rodney's breathing was slower, deeper. They'd fallen asleep almost immediately after we'd settled in for the night, exhausted from the long hike up the mountainside. The cabin was sparse, just 4 walls, a roof that looked like it might leak, and an old wood stove that we'd managed to get working enough to take the chill off. My rifle lay beside me, unloaded as Dad had insisted. His own rifle and Rodney's were propped against the wall, along with Rodney's prized .44 Magnum that he carried for bears, as he liked to remind us. The weight of responsibility felt good. I was no longer a kid who needed babysitting. I was Connor Mitchell, hunter. A sharp crack from outside jolted me, probably just a branch breaking under the weight of night dew. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter and closed my eyes. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, Dad was shaking my shoulder, his face twisted with anger. "Connor, stop kicking the damn door!" he hissed. I blinked, confused. "What? I didn't kick anything. Don't lie to me, boy. You just did it again." I sat up, fully awake now. "Dad, I swear I didn't." A violent rattle shook the cabin door. The wooden frame quivered as something struck it from outside. Not a kick, but a powerful blow that made the hinges creak. Dad's anger vanished, replaced by something I'd never seen before, fear. What the hell? Rodney was up now too, grabbing for his rifle. We all stared at the door as it shuddered again, harder this time. The entire cabin seemed to shake. "Get your rifle, Connor," Dad whispered, his voice tight. "Load it. Now." My fingers fumbled with the shells as I loaded my gun. Dad and Rodney already had theirs ready, barrels pointed at the door. The pounding stopped. For 3 heartbeats, silence hung heavy in the cabin. Then a heavy thud landed on the roof above us. "Jesus Christ," Rodney muttered. Footsteps, if you could call them that, moved across the low roof. The ceiling creaked under significant weight. Whatever was up there had to be big, really big. "Bear?" I whispered. Dad shook his head. "Bears don't play with doors before climbing on roofs." The smell hit us next, a stench so foul it made my eyes water, like rotting meat mixed with something musky and wild. I gagged, trying not to vomit. The thing above us grunted, not the grunt of a bear or deer or any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost human, but deeper, more guttural, purposeful. Dirt and debris rained down from the ceiling as the creature shifted its weight directly above us. The roof beams groaned. "It's gonna come through," Rodney said, raising his .44 Magnum. I looked at Dad. His face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool air. His hands gripped his rifle so tight his knuckles were white. That's when true terror seeped into me. Not from the creature, not from the situation, but from seeing my father, my invincible, fearless father, afraid. "I'm gonna fire a warning shot," Dad announced, his voice steadier than his hands. "Ready?" Rodney nodded. I clutched my rifle tighter. Dad aimed at the ceiling and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the small cabin. Splinters flew from the roof. The response was immediate, a high-pitched scream that sounded nothing like a bear or cougar or anything natural. It pierced through the ringing in my ears, raising goosebumps along my arms. Heavy footsteps thundered across the roof. There was a thud as the creature jumped down, followed by the crashing sound of something large moving through underbrush. "It's running away," I breathed, relief washing over me. Dad moved to the single grimy window, peering out into the darkness. "That thing ran away on 2 feet, he said to Rodney, his voice barely audible. Rodney joined him at the window. "You sure?" "Positive. It was upright, running like a man but faster." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, guns ready, listening. The stench lingered, making it hard to breathe. Finally, Dad spoke. "We need to get back to the truck. First light, we're out of here." "It's still 3 hours till dawn," Rodney said, checking his watch. "I'm not waiting," Dad replied. "That thing could come back, with friends." The thought of multiple creatures like the one on our roof made my stomach turn. "We pack up now," Dad continued. "Move fast, stay together. Connor, you take the flashlight, keep it pointed at the trail." I nodded, trying to look brave. Inside, I was falling apart. We gathered our things quickly, stuffing sleeping bags into packs, checking and rechecking our rifles. Dad eased the door open, wincing at the creak of rusted hinges. The forest outside was pitch black, the moon hidden behind clouds. Dad went first, rifle raised. Rodney nudged me to follow, with him taking up the rear. The flashlight beam seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness. 20 yards from the cabin, I heard a twig snap off to our right. Dad froze. Rodney bumped into me. "Move," Dad whispered. "Now!" We picked up the pace, no longer trying to be quiet. The snap of twigs and rustle of leaves seemed to follow us, always just out of the flashlight's reach. The smell returned, that putrid, heavy stench that coated the back of my throat. Terror gripped me, pure, animal panic. Before I could think, my legs were moving, running, sprinting down the trail, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly ahead of me. "Connor!" Dad's voice called from behind. "Stop!" I couldn't stop, couldn't think. My feet pounded the dirt path as I fled downhill toward where I thought the truck was parked. Branches whipped my face. I stumbled over roots and rocks but kept running. I realized with horror what I'd done. I had the only flashlight. I'd left Dad and Rodney in darkness with that thing nearby. I skidded to a halt, gasping for breath. The forest was silent except for my pounding heart. I turned, pointing the flashlight back up the trail. "Dad!" I called, my voice cracking. "Rodney!" No answer. "Dad!" I yelled louder. A distant crashing sound came from somewhere uphill. Not footsteps, something larger, moving fast through the underbrush. I stood frozen, caught between running back to help and continuing downhill to safety. The crashing grew louder, coming my way. Then I heard Dad's voice. "Connor, run! Get to the truck!" I ran, stumbling, crying, but running as fast as my legs would carry me. The trail widened as I neared the logging road where we'd parked. The truck appeared in my flashlight beam, our old Ford with the camper shell on the back. I reached it, yanking at the door handle, but it was locked. Of course it was locked. Dad had the keys. I dropped to the ground, crawling under the truck. Dirt and rocks dug into my palms and knees. I pressed myself against the cold metal of the axle, trying to control my breathing. Footsteps approached, human footsteps, 2 sets. "Connor!" Dad's voice called. I rolled out from under the truck. "Here!" Dad and Rodney emerged from the darkness, both out of breath. Dad grabbed me, checking me over. "Are you hurt? Why the hell did you run off like that?" "I'm sorry," I stammered. "I panicked." Dad pulled me into a rough hug. "Don't ever do that again." Rodney was already unlocking the truck. "Let's get inside now." We piled in, Dad and Rodney in the front, me in the back seat. The doors locked with a reassuring click. "Did you see it?" I asked. "Was it following us?" "Couldn't see much without the damn flashlight," Rodney muttered. Dad turned to me. "We heard it, though. It was paralleling us through the trees." "What do we do now?" "We sleep in the camper," Dad said. "Safer than trying to drive these roads in the dark. First light, we're gone." We crawled into the camper shell in the truck bed. It was cramped with the 3 of us and our gear, but it felt safer than the cabin. Dad positioned himself by the camper's back window, rifle ready. Rodney kept his .44 Magnum in his lap. I lay between them, still clutching my rifle. Sleep was impossible. Every sound from the forest made me flinch, the wind in the trees, an owl's distant call, the occasional snap of a twig. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I felt was the truck rocking. Not gently like from the wind, but violently, as if someone was pushing against it. Dad was instantly alert. "It's back!" The rocking intensified. The truck lurched sideways, tires squealing against the gravel road. Something hit the side of the camper with enough force to dent the metal. "Start the truck!" Dad yelled to Rodney, who was already scrambling through the sliding window into the cab. The engine roared to life. Rodney didn't wait. He slammed it into drive and floored it. The sudden acceleration threw me against Dad. Gravel sprayed as we fishtailed down the logging road. "What about our stuff?" I asked, realizing we'd left some gear outside the truck. "Leave it," Dad snapped. Rodney drove like a man possessed, taking the winding logging road at dangerous speeds. The camper shell rattled with every bump and turn. "We have to go back the same way we came in," Rodney called back to us. "It's the only road out." Dad nodded grimly. "Just drive, fast as you can." Dawn was just breaking as we rounded a bend, about a mile from where we'd parked. The road straightened briefly before curving again, and there it was, standing in the middle of the road, waiting. Rodney slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded, stopping about 50 yards from the creature. In the grey morning light, I could see it clearly. It stood over 7 feet tall, massive and broad-shouldered. Dark brown hair, no, not hair, fur, covered its entire body. It had no visible neck, its head sitting directly on powerful shoulders. Arms hung at its sides, huge and long, almost to its knees. It stood on 2 legs, like a man, but not a man. 600 pounds if it's an ounce, Rodney whispered. The creature's face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel it watching us, studying us. It took a step forward, arms swinging in front of its body in an unnatural gait. "Go around it," Dad said, his voice tight. "Now." Rodney gunned the engine, swerving off the road and onto the rough shoulder. The truck bounced and lurched over the uneven ground. As we drew parallel with the creature, it turned, following our movement. For a split second, I saw its face through the window, flat-nosed, with dark eyes set deep under a heavy brow ridge. Not human, not animal, something else entirely. It didn't chase us. It just watched as we bounced back onto the road and accelerated away. I kept my eyes on it through the rear window until it disappeared around the bend. None of us spoke until we hit the main highway. My hands were shaking so bad I had to set my rifle down. "What was that?" I finally asked. Dad and Rodney exchanged looks. "We don't talk about this," Dad said firmly. "Not to your mom, not to anyone at school. Nobody would believe us anyway." "But what was it?" I insisted. "I don't know," Dad admitted, "and I don't want to know." We rode in silence back to our town. I kept replaying the image of that creature in my mind, its stance, its size, the way it moved, the intelligence in those dark eyes. Dad kept his word. We never talked about it. The rifles were put away, the hunting gear stored in the attic. The next deer season came and went without mention of a trip. Same with the one after that. I'm 28 now. I've never gone hunting again. Neither has Dad or Rodney. Sometimes, when we're together and someone asks why we gave it up, Dad just says, "lost interest," and changes the subject. But on cold nights, when the wind shakes my windows, I still remember the sound of something massive walking across that cabin roof, the high-pitched scream after Dad's warning shot, the sight of that thing standing in the road, watching us with those knowing eyes. And I wonder if it's still out there, in the forests between Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens, waiting for the next hunters to stumble upon its territory. Story 6. My hands were tight on the wheel. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:08 a.m. as I drove north on Interstate 5. Just another late night heading home after a double shift at the Ferndale paper mill. The spring air felt crisp through my cracked window, and moonlight bathed the empty highway in a pale blue glow. That stretch of I-5 just past Ferndale was usually quiet this time of night. Just me, the rumble of my truck's engine, and my thoughts about crawling into bed. I reached to turn up the radio. Some old country song played low, just enough to keep me company. I rubbed my eyes. Only 15 more minutes and I'd be home. That's when I saw it. 50, maybe 75 feet ahead, something burst from the roadside brush on the east side. At first my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. It was massive, dark against the moonlit pavement, and moving fast across the northbound lanes. My foot eased off the gas pedal as I squinted. It wasn't a deer, wasn't a bear. It was upright, on two legs. My truck slowed as the thing crossed the median and continued across the southbound lanes without breaking stride. It moved with a purpose, with speed that didn't make sense for something so big. The moonlight caught it clearly as it reached the westbound shoulder. Hair, dark, shaggy hair, covered its entire body. And its height, Jesus Christ, it had to be 7, maybe 8 feet tall. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched it run fluidly, powerfully on two legs. Then I noticed what it carried. Slung over its broad shoulders was something pale, almost white in the moonlight, something limp, the size of a sheep, maybe a goat. Whatever it was, it hung lifeless as the creature sprinted. My truck was almost at a complete stop now. I watched, frozen, as the thing reached the fence along the highway, a good 4 feet high, and cleared it in a single bound. Not a hurdle, not a climb, a jump, like the fence was nothing but a small step. Then it vanished into the darkness of the trees and fields beyond. I pulled onto the shoulder, my hands shaking. My breath came in quick gasps. The radio kept playing like nothing had happened, like I hadn't just seen something impossible. I sat there for 5 minutes trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. No man could move like that. No bear runs upright carrying prey. No known animal matches what I'd seen. Eventually, I put the truck in gear and drove home, my eyes constantly checking the tree line along the highway. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't driven that stretch of road at night since. You're saying it was what, Bigfoot? Tommy laughed and took another swig of his beer. We were sitting in his garage, the Thursday night poker game winding down. I'd finally decided to tell someone. I'm not saying what it was, I replied, keeping my voice steady. I'm just telling you what I saw. Come on, Marcus. Bill shuffled the cards again, not even looking up. Probably just a bear with a deer carcass. Your tired brain filled in the rest. Bears don't run on two legs for that distance, I said, and they sure as hell don't carry things over their shoulders like a man would. The garage went quiet. 4 pairs of eyes studied me, looking for the joke, waiting for the punchline. You really believe you saw something, said Pete, my brother-in-law, his voice softer than the others. I know what I saw. I laid my cards down. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something else. Tommy and Bill exchanged glances. The kind of looks you give when your buddy's had too much to drink or is going through a rough patch. Look, Tommy said, we've all seen weird shit on night shifts. The mind plays tricks. This wasn't a trick, I cut him off. It was real, solid, right there in the headlights and moonlight. Another silence fell over the garage. I could feel the conversation shifting, their perception of me changing. Marcus Reynolds, the sensible one, suddenly talking about monsters on the highway. You tell Sarah about this? Pete asked, mentioning my wife. I shook my head. Not yet. Figured she'd react about like you guys are. Tommy laughed again, breaking the tension. Smart man. She'd have you scheduled for a psych eval by morning. The subject changed. We finished the game. I lost $20 and drove home, feeling the weight of their disbelief. The dream started 4 nights later. Always the same. I'm driving on I-5. It's dark. Something rushes across the road. But in the dreams, it stops, turns, looks at me with eyes that reflect my headlights. Then it changes direction and runs toward my truck instead of away. I'd wake up sweating, my heart racing, Sarah still asleep beside me. After the 3rd night of dreams, I called in sick to work. Spent the day on the internet instead, searching for similar sightings in Whatcom County. Found more than I expected. Reports dating back decades. Locals with stories about something in the woods. Farmers with missing livestock. Hikers who felt watched. Most were vague, some were clearly hoaxes, but a few sounded exactly like what I'd seen. By evening, Sarah knew something was wrong. She found me in the spare room, surrounded by printouts. "Marcus, what is all this?" She picked up a paper with a crude drawing of a large, hairy, bipedal creature. "Research," I said, not looking up from the laptop. "Research for what?" She sat on the edge of the desk. "Tommy called. Said you were acting strange at poker last week. Said you claimed to see some kind of monster on the highway." I finally looked at her. Her face showed concern, not mockery. That was worse somehow. "Not a monster," I said. "I don't know what it was, but I saw something, Sarah, something real." She put her hand on mine. "You've been working too hard. Those double shifts, the stress with your mum's health problems, the mortgage." "This isn't stress," I said, pulling my hand away. "I know what I saw." Her face hardened slightly. "Marcus, listen to yourself. You're sitting in here searching for Bigfoot instead of sleeping or going to work. This isn't like you." "Maybe what I saw isn't like anything we're supposed to see," I replied. She left the room without another word, slept in the guest bedroom that night. A week later, I was back at work, back to normal schedules, back to pretending I hadn't seen what I'd seen. Sarah was happier. The guys at poker stopped giving me those looks. Life returned to its routine, except I kept taking the long way home, adding 20 minutes to my commute to avoid that stretch of I-5 past Ferndale. Then came the news report. A farmer outside Ferndale reported 3 sheep missing, fence cut. Strange tracks in the mud that the local sheriff dismissed as probably coyotes, maybe a cougar. I drove out there the next day, found the farm easily enough, pulled into the gravel driveway and introduced myself to the owner, an older man named Russell Tanner. "You're the 3rd person to come asking," he said, leading me toward the back pasture. Other 2 had cameras and all sorts of equipment, looking for Bigfoot. He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I'm not here about Bigfoot," I said. "Just curious about what happened to your sheep." He stopped at a section of fence that had been recently repaired. Wire was cut clean. No animal does that. I nodded. "What about the tracks they mentioned on the news?" Russell gave me a long look, then gestured for me to follow him into a small shed. He closed the door behind us and flipped on a light. On a workbench sat a plaster cast of a large footprint. "Sheriff wouldn't even look at this," Russell said. "Said I was stirring up nonsense." I picked up the cast. The print was huge, easily 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. Not human, not bear. "Found 4 of these," Russell continued. "All the same size, all showing it walked on 2 feet. I set the cast down carefully. "Did you see anything? Hear anything that night?" Russell shook his head. "Dogs were going crazy around 1 a.m. By the time I got dressed and outside, nothing was there except the cut fence and 3 missing sheep." I swallowed hard. "This was when? Last Monday?" "That's right." "Why?" "No reason," I lied. Last Monday was when I'd started taking the long way home. I didn't tell Sarah about visiting Russell's farm, didn't tell anyone, but that night I pulled out a map of Whatcom County and marked the location. Then I marked where I'd seen the creature crossing I-5. Then I started plotting other reported sightings I'd found online. A pattern emerged, most sightings clustered in a rough corridor, stretching from the foothills of the Cascade Mountains toward Bellingham Bay. The interstate cut right through the middle of it. I'd interrupted its path that night, seen it crossing from one safe zone to another. The next day after work, I drove to the spot, parked on the shoulder near where I'd seen it cross. It was still daylight, the spring sun not yet set. Cars and trucks sped past as I stood at the edge of the road, looking at the tree line. The fence was ordinary, 4 feet of wire marking the highway boundary. Beyond it, a field stretched for about 100 yards before dense trees took over. I climbed the fence and walked toward the tree line. The field was overgrown, full of tall grass and weeds that brushed against my jeans. As I approached the trees, I noticed something, a narrow path where the grass was flattened. Not a human trail. It zigzagged too much, wasn't maintained. But something had passed through here repeatedly. I followed the path to the tree line. The woods were thick here, old growth that had somehow survived when the interstate was built. Perfect cover, perfect hiding place. At the edge of the trees, I hesitated. The path continued into the shadowy forest. The sun was getting lower. I took 3 steps in, then stopped. The temperature seemed to drop. The highway noise faded. Something snapped in the depths of the forest, a branch breaking under weight. I froze, listened. Birds had stopped singing. The forest was silent except for my breathing. Another crack, closer this time, something moving toward me. I turned and ran, crashed through the underbrush, abandoning the path, racing back toward the field and the highway beyond. My foot caught on a root and I fell hard, scraping my palms on the ground. I scrambled up and kept running. I reached the field, the tall grass whipping against me as I sprinted for the fence. The highway had never looked so good. I reached the fence, vaulted over it, and stood on the shoulder, bent over, hands on my knees, gasping for breath. Cars sped past, normal people going about their normal lives. I looked back toward the trees. Nothing moved, nothing followed. Just the wind in the grass and the setting sun casting long shadows. Maybe it had been nothing. A deer. My imagination. But as I got back in my truck, I saw something on the passenger seat that made my blood run cold. Mud. Fresh mud on the seat where I hadn't put anything. And pressed into the mud, barely visible but unmistakable, was a fingerprint. Large, human-like, but too big to be human. I started the engine with shaking hands and pulled back onto the interstate, heading home. "You need to talk to someone, Marcus." Sarah stood in our bedroom doorway, watching me pack an overnight bag. "A professional." "I'm just going camping," I said, not looking up. "One night. Need to clear my head." "With a rifle? Since when do you hunt?" I glanced at the Winchester leaning against the wall. My dad's old rifle, unused for years. Not hunting, protection. Sarah stepped into the room. "From what?" "Marcus, you're scaring me. First the late nights researching, then calling in sick. Now this sudden camping trip with a gun. This isn't you." I zipped the bag closed. "I need to know, Sarah. I need to know I'm not crazy." "By chasing monsters in the woods. That's the definition of crazy." Her voice cracked. "Please, don't go." I looked at her then. Really looked. Saw the fear and concern in her eyes. "One night," I said. "I'll be back tomorrow. If I don't find anything, I'll drop it. All of it. I'll see a therapist if that's what you want." She didn't answer, just turned and walked out of the room. I set up camp 1/2 mile from the interstate, deep enough in the woods to be hidden, but close enough to the field to watch the highway. The small tent was camouflaged. I positioned myself against a fallen log with a clear view of the field and the road beyond. The rifle sat across my lap. A spotlight and night vision monocular I'd bought online lay beside me. The sun set. The woods darkened. Highway noise faded to a distant hum. Hours passed. Mosquitoes buzzed around my head. My back ached from sitting against the log. Doubt crept in. What was I doing out here? Sarah was right. This wasn't me. Marcus Reynolds didn't stake out forests looking for monsters. Maybe I had imagined it all. Stress, fatigue, a bear and a trick of moonlight. The night grew darker, colder. I checked my watch. 1:30 a.m. Something rustled in the trees behind me. I turned, heart racing, hand tightening on the rifle. Nothing visible in the darkness. More rustling, moving away from me. Then silence. I turned back toward the field and froze. Something was crossing the open ground toward the highway, something large, moving upright on two legs. My hands fumbled for the night vision monocular. I raised it to my eye, hands trembling. The figure came into green-tinted focus. Massive, 7, maybe 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, walking purposefully toward the interstate. It wasn't carrying anything this time, just moving with long, powerful strides across the field. I lowered the monocular, raised the rifle, put my eye to the scope. The crosshairs centered on the creature's back. My finger found the trigger. One shot. I could end the mystery, prove I wasn't crazy, show the world what I'd seen. The creature reached the fence, paused, seemed to look both ways along the highway like a person would before crossing. My finger tightened on the trigger. Then the creature turned, not toward the highway but back toward the woods, toward me. It stood motionless, facing my direction. I couldn't see its eyes through the scope, but I felt it. It was looking at me, sensing me. I broke out in a cold sweat. The crosshairs wavered as my hands shook. The creature stayed completely still for 10 seconds, 20. Then it turned again, and with shocking speed sprinted back toward the woods. Not toward me, but farther south, disappearing into the trees 200 yards away. I lowered the rifle. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. My breath came in gasps. It had known I was there. Somehow it had sensed me watching. I sat motionless for an hour, afraid to move. When nothing returned, I packed up my gear with trembling hands and hiked back to where I'd parked my truck on a service road. As I loaded my equipment, I noticed something on the truck's hood. I approached slowly, flashlight beam wavering. Arranged in a deliberate pattern were 3 small river stones, not scattered randomly, placed in a perfect triangle. I swallowed hard, looked around at the dark woods surrounding the service road. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound, but I knew I wasn't alone, and I knew it wanted me to know that. Story 7. Lightning tore through the sky like a jagged scar. The sound of rain hammering against the roof drowned out our voices at the dinner table. I was 10 years old, alone in the dining room of my Aunt Martha's house on the Lummi Reservation, still picking at my chicken while everyone else had moved to the living room. The storm had knocked the power out 20 minutes earlier, leaving only a few candles to push back the darkness. "Nathan, you about done in there?" Aunt Martha called from the next room. "Almost," I answered, tearing off another bite. I liked eating slow. It drove my dad crazy back home in Oak Ridge, but Aunt Martha never rushed me. Her house sat on the edge of the reservation, a small wooden structure with peeling white paint surrounded by dense pine forest. I'd been sent to stay with her and my 3 cousins for the summer while my parents sorted through their divorce. The wind howled, pushing against the windows. The old house creaked. I could hear my cousins laughing in the other room, playing some card game by candlelight. I stabbed at a piece of potato with my fork, the plate barely visible in the dim light. Then it happened. A flash of lightning, bright enough to turn night into day for a split second. The dining room lit up, and through the thin curtains covering the window to my left, I saw it. A silhouette. Massive. Standing upright outside the window. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Another flash. The outline was clearer now. Whatever stood outside was enormous, far taller than any man I'd ever seen. The shoulders were impossibly broad, with no discernible neck between them, and what must have been its head. The shape was bulky, covered in what looked like shaggy fur that rippled slightly in the wind. It was moving, walking on 2 legs past the window. My chicken fell from my hand, landing with a soft plop on my plate. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My entire body turned to ice as I watched the massive shape continue past the window, moving with a strange, fluid gait that was too smooth for something so large. I slid off my chair and scrambled underneath the table, pulling my knees to my chest. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Aunt Martha," I tried to call out, but my voice emerged as a whisper, another flash of lightning. I stared at the window, terrified I'd see that shape pressing against the glass, looking in, but there was nothing. I stayed under that table for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Finally, I gathered enough courage to crawl out and run to the living room. "There's something outside," I blurted, interrupting my cousin's game. Aunt Martha looked up from her knitting. "What do you mean, Nathan?" "Outside the window, I saw someone huge, walking by." My voice trembled. My oldest cousin Danny, 16 and always looking for ways to tease me, grinned. Probably just old man Jenkins checking his traps. "No," I insisted. "It wasn't a person. It was big, really big, and hairy." Aunt Martha's expression changed, just slightly. Her eyes flicked toward my 11-year-old cousin Lily, who had gone very still. "It's just the storm playing tricks," Aunt Martha said finally. "Come sit with us, Nathan." I didn't sleep that night, not a wink. I shared a room with my cousin Mike, who was 12 and snored like a chainsaw. I lay in bed, covers pulled to my chin, listening to every creak of the house, every whistle of wind, every tap of branches against the window. My mind kept replaying what I'd seen, that massive, hairy silhouette moving past the window. Just before dawn, the power came back on. The sudden light from the hallway nightlight woke me from my vigilant half-sleep. Morning had arrived, grey and misty after the storm. At breakfast, no one mentioned what I'd seen. I pushed my eggs around my plate, exhausted and jumpy. "Can we go check for damage?" Danny asked Aunt Martha when we'd finished eating. She nodded. "Stay together and don't go near any downed power lines." "Can I come?" I asked, surprising myself. Part of me wanted to stay as far from the windows as possible, but another part needed to know if there was any sign of what I'd seen. "Sure," Danny said, unusually friendly. "Let's go, city boy." The four of us, Danny, Mike, Lily, and me, pulled on our boots and jackets and headed outside. The air smelled fresh after the storm, like wet earth and pine. Broken branches littered the yard, and a small tree had fallen across the driveway. "Let's check the perimeter," Danny said, sounding like the military shows he was always watching. We circled the house, noting a loose gutter and some missing shingles. When we reached the side of the house with the dining room window, I slowed down, my heart starting to race again. "This is where I saw it," I said quietly. Danny and Mike exchanged glances, but didn't laugh like I expected. Instead, Mike stepped closer to the window, examining the ground. "Holy shit," he whispered. "What?" I moved next to him. There, pressing deep into the wet soil and flattened grass, was a footprint. But not any footprint I'd ever seen. It was enormous, at least 16 inches long and incredibly wide. The impression was clear: 5 toes, a broad ball of the foot, and a substantial heel, sunk nearly 2 inches into the mud. "That's—" Danny started, then fell silent as we all noticed there were more prints, forming a path that led from the forest's edge, past the window, and around toward the back of the house. The footprints were spaced far apart, indicating an incredible stride length. Whatever had made them was huge and heavy. "Sasquatch," Lily said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken all morning. "Don't be stupid," Danny snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. I crouched down, staring at the nearest print. This is what I saw. Something big was watching me through the window. Mike nodded slowly. "My friend Joe's grandpa says they come down from the mountains during big storms sometimes. Says they're curious about us." "That's just stories," Danny said, but he was looking nervously at the tree line now. Lily tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma says they protect the forest. They only watch. They don't hurt people unless people try to hurt them." I remembered how the creature had simply walked past the window, not stopping, not trying to break in, just observing. "We should tell Aunt Martha," I said. Danny shook his head. "She'll just say it's a bear or something." "These aren't bear tracks," Mike argued. "Bears don't walk upright for this long." We followed the tracks. They circled the entire house, as if whatever made them had been patrolling the perimeter. The prints led back into the forest at the exact spot they had emerged. When we returned to the house, Aunt Martha was washing the breakfast dishes. She looked up as we entered. "Find anything interesting?" she asked. We all exchanged glances. Danny spoke first. "Just some broken branches and stuff." I couldn't hold back. There were footprints, huge ones, all around the house. Aunt Martha's hands stilled in the soapy water. She didn't look surprised. "What did they look like?" she asked quietly. I described them and what I'd seen the night before. The massive silhouette, the broad shoulders with no neck, the shaggy outline. Aunt Martha dried her hands slowly on a dish towel. "My grandmother used to tell stories," she said finally, "about the guardians of the forest. The elders say they've lived in these woods since before people came." "You mean Bigfoot?" Mike asked. Aunt Martha smiled slightly. "That's what white folks call them. We have other names." "So you believe me?" I asked, surprised. "I believe you saw something, Nathan. These woods are old, and they hold many secrets." She paused. "My grandmother said they sometimes check on us during storms, make sure we're safe." "It was watching me eat chicken," I said, still unsettled by the memory. Aunt Martha laughed softly. "Maybe it was just curious. Wouldn't you be curious about someone different from you?" That afternoon, Danny and Mike wanted to go into the forest to look for more signs. Aunt Martha forbade it. "You don't go looking for them," she said firmly. "That's disrespectful." Instead, we spent the day cleaning up storm debris from the yard. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints, about the massive figure walking past the window. If it had wanted to, it could have easily broken the glass, reached inside with long arms but it hadn't. It had just walked by, observing. That night, I found it hard to fall asleep again. Every creak made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. Around midnight, I got out of bed and went to the window, peering out at the moonlit yard. The forest beyond was dark, impenetrable. As I watched, I thought I saw movement at the tree line, something tall shifting among the pines. My breath caught. I blinked, and whatever I'd seen was gone. The next morning, I convinced Mike to come with me to check if the footprints were still there. They were, though less distinct after another day. "How big do you think it was?" I asked as we crouched by one of the tracks. Mike considered. "Dad's 6'2", and his foot is way smaller than this. Maybe 7, 8 feet tall." The idea made my stomach tighten. "And strong enough to tear the door off if it wanted to." "But it didn't," Mike pointed out. "Lily's right. Grandma used to say they're protectors, not monsters." As the days passed, the footprints gradually disappeared, erased by rain and wind. I started sleeping better, though I still sometimes woke in the night, certain I'd heard heavy footsteps outside. A week after the storm, Danny came running into the house, wild-eyed and out of breath. "I saw it," he gasped. "In the clearing by the creek, just standing there watching me." Aunt Martha made him sit down, gave him water. "Tell us exactly what happened," she said calmly. Danny's hands shook as he described hiking to the creek alone. "Something snapped behind me. I turned around and there it was, maybe 50 yards away, huge, covered in dark reddish-brown hair. It just stood there looking at me." "What did you do?" I asked, fascinated and terrified. "Nothing, I couldn't move. Then it made this sound, like a low whistle, and just turned and walked into the trees. It moved so fast, like it wasn't even trying." Aunt Martha nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "It lets you see it. That's a gift, Danny." That night, Aunt Martha built a small fire in the backyard fire pit. She burned some herbs that filled the air with sweet smoke. "An offering," she explained. "A thank you." As we sat around the fire, she told us stories her grandmother had passed down. Stories of the forest people who had lived in these woods for thousands of years. how they avoided humans but sometimes took an interest in those who respected the land. "The storm brought one close enough for Nathan to see," she said. "It was checking on us, making sure we were safe." "But why would it care?" I asked. Aunt Martha smiled. "Everything in the forest is connected, Nathan. They feel responsible for these woods and everything in them, including us, who live at the edge of their domain." I stayed with Aunt Martha and my cousins for another month. We never saw definitive signs of the creature again, though sometimes, hiking in the woods, I'd feel eyes watching me from the dense undergrowth. Once, I found a pile of blackberries placed on a stump, near a trail we frequently used, berries picked from bushes too high for any of us to reach. On my last night on the reservation, I woke suddenly at 3 a.m. Something had roused me from sleep, a sound I couldn't quite identify. I went to the window and looked out. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. The forest edge was a dark wall beyond the yard. As I watched, something moved there, a massive shadow separating from the trees. It stood upright at the forest edge, taller than any human. Even from this distance I could see the breadth of its shoulders, the absence of a neck, the shaggy outline of its body. It raised one long arm, holding it steady in the air, not threatening, not beckoning, just acknowledging. I raised my own arm, mirroring the gesture. For a moment we stayed like that, human boy and forest guardian, connected across the divide between our worlds. Then it lowered its arm and melted back into the darkness of the trees. The next morning, as my dad loaded my suitcase into his car, I took one last look at the forest. I knew then that I would return to Aunt Martha's house many times in the years ahead. And sometimes during storms, I would look out the window, knowing that something ancient might be looking back, checking on the strange, hairless creatures who lived at the edge of its domain. Not a monster, a watcher, a guardian. And I had been given the rare gift of glimpsing it in the flash of lightning on a stormy summer night. Story 8. The air felt sharp in my lungs that February morning as I turned my beat-up Chevy onto the winding road up Larch Mountain. Fresh snow crunched under the tires. The heater sputtered warm air against the windshield while my buddy Mike dozed in the passenger seat, his breath fogging up the window. Yeah, we're both named Mike Reynolds and Mike Dayton. Made for some confusing conversations back in high school, but we'd been friends since 3rd grade and somehow made it work. "Hey, wake up. We're almost there," I said, nudging his shoulder. The road narrowed as we climbed higher into the Cascades, patches of ice glinting in the early morning sun. Mike rubbed his eyes. "Man, remind me why we decided to come up here in February." "Because we're idiots who thought hiking would somehow be more interesting in the cold," I said. I was 19, had just finished my first semester at Portland Community College, and was desperate for something, anything, that wasn't textbooks or my part-time job at the hardware store. The Summit parking lot appeared around the bend, completely empty. Not surprising, given it was barely 8:30 in the morning in the dead of winter. I parked near the trailhead and cut the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy, like the mountain was holding its breath. "At least we've got the place to ourselves," Mike said, zipping his jacket up to his chin. We stepped out of the car, and the cold hit me like a slap. I pulled my woolen hat down over my ears and reached into the back seat for my backpack. The parking lot was small, surrounded by tall pines dusted with snow. A sign pointed toward the Summit lookout, 100 yards ahead. "Race you to the top," Mike suggested, already starting to jog toward the path. I followed, our boots crunching on the packed snow. The trail opened to a clearing where the oval-shaped lookout stood, surrounded by a wooden fence. That's when we saw it. We both stopped dead in our tracks. Inside the fenced lookout area stood what I can only describe as an enormous brown, hairy creature. It was just standing there, perfectly still, like it was taking in the view of Mount Hood in the distance. The thing was massive, It took up almost half the available space in the lookout area. "Mike," I whispered, not knowing which one of us I was addressing. Neither of us moved. The creature slowly turned toward us. That's when I got a clear look at it. No visible neck, just a massive head attached to wide shoulders. It must have been at least 4 feet wide. The hair covering its body was a dark brown, almost black in places. For about 10 seconds, it just stared at us. I couldn't make out facial features from that distance, but I felt its gaze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Then, with deliberate movements, the creature bent down and picked up what looked like a large cardboard box with its left arm, extending it fully. It turned away from us and walked off, its right arm swinging naturally at its side. "Holy shit," Mike Dayton whispered. "Did you—" "Yeah," I said, my voice cracking. "I saw it." The spell broke, and we both sprinted toward the lookout. By the time we reached the fence, the creature was gone. We climbed over the wooden railing and scanned the area frantically. Nothing. No footprints in the snow, no cardboard box, no sign that anything had been there at all. Where did it go? I spun around, checking every direction. There's nowhere to hide. The lookout area offered views in all directions. Beyond the fence on one side, the mountain dropped away steeply. The only conceivable exit was through a small gate that connected to a 5-mile hiking trail that wound through the dense forest below. "This is impossible," Mike said, his breath coming in white puffs. "That thing was huge. It couldn't just disappear." I walked to the fence where I'd seen the creature standing. The top rail reached just below my shoulders. I'm 5'8". The rail couldn't have been more than 4 feet high, and when the creature stood here, the rail had only reached to its groin area. "Mike, it must have been at least 8 feet tall," I said, feeling cold that had nothing to do with the February air. "Maybe more," he agreed, his face pale. A metallic click made us both jump. The gate at the far end of the lookout swung open, and 2 men stepped through. My first thought was that they looked completely out of place. Despite the snow and freezing temperature, they wore short-sleeved shirts. Not modern ones, but the kind my grandpa would wear, tucked neatly into tan dress slacks with brown belts. They had on dress shoes, actual leather dress shoes in the snow. No coats, no hats, no gloves. They approached us with stiff, purposeful strides. Both were around 50, with short, neat haircuts that looked freshly trimmed. Their faces showed no reaction to the cold. "Did you see it?" I blurted out before they could speak. "The creature! It was right here!" The taller of the 2 men looked at me with blank eyes. "A woman in a fur coat," he said flatly. "We saw a woman in a fur coat." I stared at him. "What?" "No, it was at least 8 feet tall. Brown, hairy, not a coat." The second man's mouth twitched into what might have been an attempt at a smile. "A woman in a fur coat," he repeated, exactly the same tone as his companion. Mike stepped forward. "Listen, we both saw it. It picked up a box and walked off. Where did it go?" The men glanced at each other. A silent communication passed between them. "You boys should head back down," the first one said. "Storm coming." I looked at the sky. Clear blue, not a cloud in sight. "What storm?" Mike asked. Neither man answered. Instead, they turned and walked back toward the gate, not bothering to look at the famous panoramic vista that people climb all this way to see. "Wait!" I called, jogging after them. "Who are you guys? Park rangers?" They didn't turn around, just continued through the gate and disappeared down the trail. Mike and I followed them to the gate, but by the time we reached it, the men were nowhere to be seen on the trail below. "This is freaking me out," Mike said, his voice shaking slightly. "Did they even look cold to you?" "Not at all," I said. "And a woman in a fur coat. That thing was twice the size of any person." We stood there for several minutes, scanning the area, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The lookout remained empty and still. "Let's check for tracks," I suggested. We spent the next hour searching the entire lookout area and the beginning of the trail. We found our own boot prints in the snow and what might have been the dress shoes of the strange men, but nothing large enough to belong to the creature. No sign of a cardboard box either. Could we both have hallucinated the same thing? Mike asked as we finally gave up the search. I shook my head. Not a chance. We saw it. And those guys, they knew something. The drive back down the mountain was tense and quiet. We kept replaying what we'd seen, comparing details, confirming with each other that it had really happened. By the time we reached Portland, we'd convinced ourselves to go to the ranger station and report the encounter. The ranger on duty, a heavy-set man named Cliff, listened to our story with an increasingly skeptical expression. "Boys, we get Bigfoot reports every couple of months," he said when we finished. "Usually from folks who've had a bit too much to drink around their campfire." "We weren't drinking," I insisted, "and we both saw it, plain as day." Cliff sighed. "Look, I'll file a report, but don't expect much. As for the men you described, definitely not park rangers. We wear proper uniforms, especially in winter conditions." "Then who were they?" Mike asked. Cliff shrugged. "Hikers, maybe. Some folks aren't prepared for mountain conditions." But these men hadn't seemed unprepared. They'd seemed like they didn't need preparation at all. Over the next few weeks, Mike and I became obsessed with what we'd seen. We researched Bigfoot sightings in the Cascades, finding dozens of reports spanning decades. Some descriptions matched what we'd witnessed, but none mentioned the strange men. We returned to Larch Mountain twice more that spring, but found nothing unusual. The ranger station never followed up on our report. That summer, while working at my uncle's gas station, I met a truck driver who claimed to have worked for a logging company near Mount Hood in the 1970s. When I mentioned our experience, his face went pale. "You saw the men in the tan slacks?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my skin prickling. "They showed up at 3 different Bigfoot sightings I know of," he said. "Always after, never during. Always saying the same thing. Misidentification, weather balloon, woman in a fur coat, whatever fits." "Who are they?" I asked. The trucker glanced around the empty gas station. "Government, some people say. Others think there's something else entirely. Not from here, if you get my meaning." I thought about how they seemed unaffected by the cold, their outdated clothes, their strange manner of speaking. "You mean like, not from Earth?" I asked, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. The trucker just tapped his nose. "All I know is, after they showed up at our logging camp, the company suddenly got a massive federal contract. The sighting was never mentioned again. Boss acted like it never happened." Over the years, Mike and I have compared notes on our experience countless times. The details never change. The creature's massive size, the way it picked up that box, the strange men who appeared minutes later wearing completely inappropriate clothing for the conditions. I'm 26 now. I've hiked all over the Cascades, spent nights alone in the wilderness, but I've never again seen anything like what we encountered that February morning. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was some elaborate hallucination, until I talked to Mike and confirmed that his memory matches mine exactly. The thing I keep coming back to is this: what was in that box? And why did those men show up so quickly after the creature disappeared? Last year, I read about a government program called Project Blue Book that investigated UFO sightings in the 1950s and 60s. Men in suits would show up after sightings, offer mundane explanations, tell witnesses they were mistaken about what they saw. The descriptions sounded eerily familiar. I don't know if what we saw was a Bigfoot, an alien, or something else entirely. I don't know who those men were or how they disappeared so quickly on that trail, but I know what I saw, and I know those men were covering it up. Sometimes when I'm driving near Mount Hood and I catch a glimpse of Larch Mountain in the distance, I feel that same chill I felt that morning. Something's up there, something that isn't supposed to be seen. And people, or whatever those men were, are working hard to keep it that way. I still have nightmares about it. Not the creature. Strangely, That doesn't frighten me much in retrospect. It was just there, existing, not threatening us. No, what haunts me are those men with their blank stares and fake smiles telling me not to believe my own eyes. A woman in a fur coat, they said. But I know what I saw standing at that lookout, and it was no woman. Story 9. My stomach clenched as we turned onto the dirt road leading to Earl Whitfield's property. It was mid-July 2004, and the summer heat had settled over Piney Creek like a wet blanket. I've hunted these woods since I was 12, but something about this job felt different. Earl had called my buddy Darrell in a panic 3 days earlier about his goats being killed. "Mountain lions, what I reckon," Earl had told us when we met him at the general store to get the key to his gate. "Or maybe one of them big bobcats. Whatever it is, it's tearing my livestock to pieces. I'll pay you boys $500 if you take care of it." $500 was good money for a weekend's work, especially for 3 broke 20-somethings like us. I was Lucas Bailey, 24, working construction during the week. Darrell Simmons and Todd Parker had been my hunting buddies since high school. Darrell worked at the sawmill, and Todd did odd jobs between community college semesters. We pulled up to Earl's property around 4 in the afternoon. The place was massive, nearly 400 acres of pasture, woods, and an apple orchard that had seen better days. Earl mentioned he only came out on weekends, which explained the overgrown state of things. "Look at that," Todd said, pointing to our left as we drove in. About 30 yards from the gate lay what remained of a goat. My blood ran cold. I'd seen plenty of predator kills before, but this was different. The animal had been ripped apart, not just killed and eaten. Bones jutted out at unnatural angles, shattered beyond recognition. The rib cage was splayed open, organs missing. "Jesus Christ," Darrell muttered. "No mountain lion does that." I parked near the travel trailer Earl had said we could use, an old airstream that had probably been sitting there since the 80s. As we unloaded our gear, I noticed strange circular ruts around the campsite. They were about 2 inches deep and formed a perfect circle, maybe 40 feet in diameter, surrounding the trailer. "What do you think made these?" I asked. Todd shrugged. "Tractor, maybe. Earl must have been doing something out here." We continued setting up camp. I loaded my Remington 700 and placed it by the door. Darrell had his 12-gauge, and Todd brought his 30-06. Whatever had killed those goats, we were prepared to handle it. "Let's scout before dark," I suggested. "Get the lay of the land." We headed toward the apple orchard first. It was in shambles. Lower branches had been torn off the trees, not cut, but violently ripped away. Rotting apples covered the ground, many with single bites taken out of them. "This ain't right," Darrell said, picking up one of the half-eaten apples. "Bears don't eat like this. They take an apple and eat the whole damn thing." The sun was lowering as we made our way to a small canyon that overlooked one of the pastures. The air felt still and oppressive. No birds sang. Even the insects seemed quieter than normal. "Look," Todd said, pointing down into the canyon. Another goat lay dead, this one fresher than the one by the gate. Its udders and guts were completely gone, and one of its hind legs appeared to have been twisted off, like a turkey leg at Thanksgiving dinner. "We need to set up a blind here tonight," I said. "Whatever's doing this will probably come back." We marked the spot and headed back to camp as darkness approached. That's when we saw it. A goat leg placed carefully on top of the trailer's skylight. Not thrown there, but deliberately positioned. "That wasn't there when we arrived," Darrell said, his voice tight. "No," I agreed, "it wasn't." We retrieved the leg using a long stick. The flesh had been stripped clean from the bone, and the joint showed signs of being twisted, not cut. Night fell fast. We ate a quick dinner of beans and hot dogs, then grabbed our rifles and flashlights. The plan was to set up in the canyon first, then check the orchard if we didn't see anything. The night was moonless and dark as pitch. Our flashlights cut weak paths through the blackness as we made our way to the canyon. We set up behind some bushes and waited, scanning the area with our lights every few minutes. After about an hour, Darrell nudged me. "Look over there," he whispered. "Eye shine." I directed my light where he pointed. Sure enough, two glowing orbs reflected back, about 6 feet off the ground, too high for a mountain lion. Then another set appeared, and another. "What the hell?" Todd hissed. The eye shine moved rapidly through the trees, too fast and too high for normal wildlife. They weaved between trunks with unnatural agility, never dropping in height. "Let's check the orchard," I suggested, trying to keep my voice steady. We backed away from the canyon and made our way to the apple trees. The orchard was dead silent. No rustling leaves, no scurrying nocturnal animals, just silence. Then we saw it again, eye shine about 6 feet off the ground, between two trees at the orchard's edge. I focused my light directly on it. The eyes closed. I'd never seen that before. Wild animals' eyes typically stay reflective even when lit directly. But these closed, as if the creature was trying to hide its presence. As I moved my light away, something even stranger happened. The eyes reopened, but not simultaneously. The eye furthest from my light opened first, followed by the second eye. "I'm taking a shot," Darrell whispered, raising his shotgun. He fired a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked through the night like thunder. The creature bolted, not with the bounding motion of a four-legged animal, but with a fluid bipedal gait. Most disturbing was how the eyeshine maintained a consistent height as it ran. No up and down motion like you'd expect from a running animal. It disappeared into the darkness with an ear-splitting shriek I'll never forget. A sound that started like a woman's scream, but ended in a guttural, animalistic growl. "What the fuck was that?" Todd's voice shook. "I don't know," I said. "But it's not a mountain lion." We returned to camp, adrenaline making our hands shake. Inside the trailer, we double-checked the locks and loaded fresh rounds into our weapons. The sounds started around 2 a.m. Intense screeching and grunting from multiple directions surrounded the trailer. It wasn't just one creature. It sounded like at least 3 or 4, communicating with each other. Then, as suddenly as they began, the sounds stopped. The silence was almost worse. "I need a beer," I said, grabbing my rifle. "Cover me while I go to the truck." Darrell positioned himself at the window with his shotgun as I opened the door. The night air hit me like a wall as I stepped outside. The truck was only 20 feet away, parked near a line of trees. I reached it without incident and grabbed a 6-pack from the cooler in the back seat. As I shut the door, I felt it, an enormous thud as something landed in the truck bed. The entire vehicle dropped under the weight and then sprang back up. I spun around, raising my rifle. In the split second before it vanished, I caught a glimpse of a large, muscular leg and a dark grey blur leaping from the truck into the trees. I ran back to the trailer, heart pounding against my ribs. "Something just jumped in and out of my truck," I gasped. "Something big." We watched from the windows for the next hour. Around 3:30 a.m., a group of about 12 cattle in the nearby field began behaving bizarrely. They formed a tight circle with their backs touching, facing outward. Then they started moving in a synchronized pattern, maintaining the circle formation. "I've never seen cows do that," Todd whispered. We looked away for maybe 5 minutes, discussing what to do next. When we looked back outside, the cows were gone, vanished. The field was empty. I noticed something else. My truck's passenger door had a massive dent that hadn't been there before, as if something had slammed into it with tremendous force. The hours before dawn were the worst. We heard a series of heavy thuds moving back and forth in the tree line, the unmistakable sound of something large walking on 2 legs. The footsteps were spaced too far apart to be human. As the first hint of grey light appeared in the east, I raised my rifle and peered through the scope, scanning the tree line methodically. That's when I saw it. In the dim pre-dawn light, an enormous figure was climbing one of the larger oak trees with terrifying agility. The creature was at least 7 feet tall, with disproportionately long arms and legs. Its skin or fur, I couldn't tell which, was a mottled greyish colour. I steadied my breathing and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out. The being tumbled from its perch, hitting a branch head-first on the way down before crashing to the ground with a heavy thud. "I hit it!" I shouted. We burst from the trailer, rifles ready. In the growing light, we could see the creature struggling to its feet. It clutched its shoulder where my bullet had struck. For just a moment, it turned toward us. Its face wasn't quite human or animal. A flattened nose, wide-set eyes that reflected the early morning light, and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. It stood upright, its posture unmistakably bipedal. Then it was gone, crashing through the underbrush with surprising speed, despite its injury. "We need to get the hell out of here," Darrell said. "Right now." We didn't argue. We threw our gear into the truck haphazardly, not bothering to pack properly. As I tossed my duffel bag into the bed, movement caught my eye. From the tree line emerged another creature, larger than the one I'd shot. It stood fully upright at the edge of the woods, at least 8 feet tall. Its arms hung almost to its knees, ending in hands with long, curved fingers. It locked eyes with me. I've been afraid before, when I nearly drowned in the river as a kid, when I got lost hunting in a blizzard. But this was different. This was primal terror, a feeling so intense my body couldn't process it. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The creature held my gaze for what seemed like eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it turned and melted back into the forest. "Lucas, let's go!" Todd's voice snapped me back. I scrambled into the driver's seat, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. We peeled out of there, not stopping until we reached town. We told Earl we couldn't find what was killing his goats. We gave him back half the money and never returned to his property. I've spent 19 years trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched every known predator, every cryptid sighting in North America. Nothing matches what we encountered. Darrell moved to Ohio the following year. Todd refuses to talk about that weekend. I still hunt, but never alone and never at night. Sometimes I wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of that inhuman shriek echoing in my head. I don't know what stalks the woods around Piney Creek. I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural areas at dusk, I catch myself scanning the tree line, watching for eye shine that closes when you shine a light on it, and I drive a little faster. Story 10. The January chill cut through my jacket as I checked my watch one last time before lights out. 9:45 p.m. 20 boys had finally settled into their bunks across the scattered Adirondack shelters of our Lewis River camp. Most would be asleep by now, their energy spent after a day of hiking and setting up camp. The trees around us stood like silent sentinels against the night sky, branches swaying slightly in the winter wind. "They're finally quiet," Thomas Parker said, walking up beside me. As scoutmaster, he'd been leading these trips for years longer than I had. At 42, Thomas was a seasoned outdoorsman with salt and pepper hair and the kind of weathered face you only get from decades in the elements. "About time," I replied, rubbing my hands together for warmth. "These 11 and 12-year-olds have more energy than should be legal. I'm James Wilson, Assistant Scoutmaster for Troop 217 out of Battleground, Washington. At 35, I'd been helping Thomas with these boys for 3 years now. We'd picked this particular Boy Scout camp near the Lewis River because of its isolation, good for teaching the kids self-reliance, even in winter." Thomas pointed his flashlight toward the shelter we'd be sharing about 50 yards from the main group of boys. "Let's head to our bunks. Morning comes early." We had just turned to walk when it happened. A howl pierced the night. Not a coyote, not a wolf, something else entirely. Something that made the hair on my neck stand straight up. Thomas froze mid-step. "What the hell was that?" Before I could answer, another sound followed, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate the air around us. Then a series of calls, almost like speech but not quite human, echoed through the trees. "That's not a cougar," I said, my breath visible in the cold air. "Not a bear either." Thomas nodded slowly, his face illuminated by his flashlight. "I've hunted these woods since I was 15. Never heard anything like that." We stood listening as the sounds continued, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, as if multiple creatures circled our camp. The vocalizations ranged from deep growls to high-pitched whoops that cut through the night air. "Should we check on the boys?" I asked. Thomas considered this, then shook his head. "They're probably sleeping through it. No sense alarming them if they haven't noticed. Let's keep this to ourselves for now." We made another round of the shelters, finding the scouts indeed asleep. When we finally reached our own shelter, the sounds had subsided, though neither of us mentioned this small mercy. Our Adirondack was like the others, 3 solid walls, an open front facing away from the prevailing wind, and double bunks built into the walls. I took the lower bunk, while Thomas climbed to the top, about 8 feet off the ground. "Sleep with one eye open tonight, James," Thomas said, only half joking. "Whatever's out there, I don't like it." "Maybe it's that Bigfoot the locals are always talking about," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Thomas didn't laugh. "Just get some sleep." I dozed fitfully, the temperature dropping as the night deepened. My watch read 2:17 a.m. when Thomas's sharp intake of breath woke me. I lay still, unsure if he was having a nightmare. Then I heard it, the snap of twigs and rustling of leaves just outside our shelter. Something was moving out there, something heavy. Each footstep landed with purpose, not the random scampering of a raccoon or the light-footed tread of a deer. I whispered, "Thomas, you awake?" No answer came from above, but I could tell from his breathing that he was conscious and alert. The footsteps stopped directly in front of our shelter's open side. I lay frozen in my lower bunk, blanket pulled to my chin, afraid to move. A sudden crash of breaking branches erupted outside, followed by Thomas's shout, "Jesus Christ!" I bolted upright, banging my head on the upper bunk. What? What is it?" In the darkness, I could make out Thomas sitting straight up in his bunk, his body rigid. The sounds of something large crashing through the underbrush filled the night, branches snapping and vegetation being trampled as whatever it was fled from our shelter. "Thomas, what happened?" I fumbled for my flashlight, clicking it on and pointing it toward the open side of the shelter. Thomas's voice came strained and hoarse. "It was standing right there, James. Right fucking there, looking right at me." I swung the flashlight beam outside, revealing nothing but the dark woods and a tangle of vine maple brush at the edge of the clearing. Several branches hung broken and splintered. What was standing there? I asked, though some part of me already knew the answer. Thomas climbed down from his bunk, his movements stiff, mechanical. When he turned to face me, his expression was drained of color, even in the dim light. It was at eye level with me, James. Eye level while I was in the top bunk. The implication hit me like a physical blow. The top bunk was at least 8 feet off the ground. "That's not possible," I said automatically. Thomas sat heavily on my bunk. It was looking right at me, just standing there watching me sleep. When I woke up and saw it, it took off. But what was it? A bear standing up? He shook his head firmly. "Bears don't stand 8 feet tall on 2 legs and look you in the eye with intelligence, James." We stayed awake the rest of the night, backs against the rear wall of the shelter, flashlights ready. Neither of us said much. What was there to say? The sounds of the night eventually returned. Insects, an occasional hoot of an owl, but the otherworldly calls and growls didn't resume. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees, we finally ventured outside. The ground around our shelter was covered with a thick carpet of fallen leaves, making tracks impossible to discern, but the damage to the vegetation was unmistakable. Branches of vine maple were snapped and broken in a clear path leading away from our shelter. I touched one of the broken limbs, thick as my wrist. "You need an axe to break vine maple this size," I said quietly. "It's like iron." Thomas nodded grimly. "Whatever did this is strong, stronger than any man I've ever known." We followed the trail of destruction about 30 yards into the woods before it disappeared where the underbrush thinned out. By unspoken agreement, we returned to camp and began preparations to leave, early. "What do we tell the boys?" I asked as we walked back. "Nothing," Thomas replied firmly. "Not a damn thing. We'll say there's bad weather coming in." The scouts grumbled about cutting the trip short, but they packed up without too much complaint. I watched them joke and push each other as they worked, their innocent normalcy a stark contrast to the tension Thomas and I carried. None of them mentioned hearing strange sounds in the night. None of them had seen what Thomas had seen. As we hiked out, I kept glancing back, feeling watched from the thick forest surrounding us. Thomas stayed at the rear of our group, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. Neither of us relaxed until we reached the parking area where our vehicles waited. On the drive back to Battleground, Thomas finally broke his silence. "I've been Scoutmaster for 15 years, James. Led dozens of camping trips. I know every animal in these woods, every sound they make, every track they leave." He paused, hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. "What I saw last night wasn't from any field guide. You really think it was a—" I couldn't bring myself to say the word out loud. "A Bigfoot?" Thomas finished for me. "I don't know what else to call it. 8 to 9 feet tall, standing on 2 legs with a mass of dark hair covering its body. And those eyes." He shuddered visibly. "Human-like, but not human. There was something in them, James. Curiosity, maybe. Intelligence for sure." "Why would it come right up to our shelter like that?" Thomas shook his head. "I've been asking myself the same question. It wasn't hunting us. It had every opportunity if that's what it wanted. It was observing, like it was studying us the same way we study wildlife." We fell silent again, each lost in our own thoughts as the highway unspooled before us. Thomas cleared his throat. "We're not scheduling Camp Lewis River again. Not in winter anyway. Too remote." I nodded my agreement. The thought of bringing children back to that place made my stomach turn. Back in Battleground, life resumed its normal rhythm. Days passed, then weeks. Thomas and I spoke of that night only once more, over beers in his garage, while his wife was visiting her sister in Portland. "I've been doing some research," he said, pulling a folder from a shelf. "There have been sightings in that area going back decades. The locals call it Bigfoot country." He showed me newspaper clippings, testimonials, blurry photographs, all describing encounters similar to ours, people hearing strange calls in the night, glimpses of large, hairy figures moving through the trees, broken branches that shouldn't have been possible to break. "Why didn't we know about this before we took the boys there?" I asked. Thomas shrugged. "Would you have believed it if someone had told you?" I wouldn't have. Not until I saw it with my own eyes. 3 months after our trip, during a regular scout meeting, one of the boys, Ricky Danvers, a bright kid with glasses too big for his face, approached us as the others played outside. "Mr. Parker, Mr. Wilson," he said hesitantly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure, Ricky," Thomas replied. "What's on your mind?" "That camping trip we took in January to the Lewis River camp?" Ricky glanced around to make sure we were alone. "Did something happen there? Something you didn't tell us about?" Thomas and I exchanged looks. "Why do you ask?" I said carefully. "Because I heard noises that night, really weird noises, and I think I saw something moving around the shelters. Something big." Ricky looked down at his shoes. "The other guys made fun of me when I mentioned it, so I stopped talking about it." Thomas placed a hand on Ricky's shoulder. What exactly did you see, son? I'm not sure. It was dark, but it was tall. Taller than you, Mr. Parker, and it moved like it knew where it was going, like it was checking on us. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warmth of the meeting hall. Thomas nodded slowly. Ricky, sometimes there are things in the woods that science hasn't properly explained yet. That doesn't mean they're not real. Ricky's eyes widened. You did see something. We heard some unusual wildlife, Thomas admitted carefully. And yes, I saw something that night that I can't explain, but I need you to understand something very important. He knelt down to meet Ricky at eye level. Whatever it was, it didn't hurt anyone. It could have, but it didn't. It was just curious about us. Like we were studying it and it was studying us? Ricky asked. Exactly like that, I said, surprised by the boy's insight. Ricky considered this for a moment, then nodded. I won't tell the others. They wouldn't believe me anyway. After Ricky left to join his friends, Thomas turned to me. Smart kid. Too smart, I agreed. Do you think others saw something too? Possibly. Kids sleep sound, but not all of them, all the time. Thomas watched the boys playing through the window. But they'll convince themselves it was a dream or their imagination. Most of them anyway. That conversation happened 5 years ago. Thomas retired as scoutmaster 2 years back, moving to Eastern Oregon to be closer to his daughter's family. I took over the troop, continuing our tradition of monthly camping trips. But we never returned to the Lewis River camp. Sometimes, on cold January nights when the wind howls around my house, I find myself remembering those inhuman sounds that echoed through the forest. I remember Thomas's face when he climbed down from that bunk, the look of a man whose understanding of the world had fundamentally shifted. And I wonder about what's out there in the deep woods of Washington State, moving quietly between the trees, watching and waiting. Something that can snap vine maple like twigs, that stands as tall as a basketball hoop, that looks into shelters where men sleep with eyes that reflect an intelligence we don't understand. I wonder if it remembers us too. Story 11. The headlights of our truck cut through the darkness as we pulled into the campground beneath the Three Sisters Mountains, May 1980. We'd been on the road for 9 hours straight, making our way from Northern California up to Washington State. My wife Rachel and the kids were half asleep in the truck, the children's faces slack with exhaustion. Dad was following in his own vehicle behind us, hauling the camping trailer. We're here, I announced, killing the engine. The sudden silence was punctuated only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant sound of crickets. The campground was nearly empty. Just a few scattered tents and RVs in the distance. Not surprising for a Thursday night in late spring. Most folks were still in school or working. The air felt cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Let's get everyone settled, Rachel mumbled, rousing herself from the passenger seat. Your dad can help us set up in the morning. I nodded, too tired to argue. We'd intended to reach our destination hours ago, but a flat tire and road construction had delayed us. I need to take a piss first, I said, stepping out of the truck. The campsite was partially illuminated by the truck's headlights, which I'd left on, and the thin silver of moonlight filtering through the trees. The woods around us were dense and dark. Rather than trudge all the way to the campground restrooms, I decided to step just inside the tree line to relieve myself. Don't go far, Rachel called after me. Just gonna step behind that big pine, I replied, pointing to a massive tree about 30 feet from our campsite. I walked into the darkness, my boots crunching on pine needles and twigs. The sounds of the forest enveloped me, a gentle breeze rustling the canopy above, the distant hooting of an owl. I found a spot behind a large pine, unzipped my jeans, and began to relieve myself. The headlights from the truck cast long, strange shadows through the trees, and I watched my own shadow stretch across the forest floor. That's when I felt it. A presence. Heavy, watching, imposing. The air around me changed, becoming thick with a musky animal smell. Not skunk, something more primal, oppressive, wild. The hairs on my arms stood up, and a cold wave of dread washed down my spine. I finished hurriedly, zipped up and turned around. 20 feet away stood a massive figure. The weak moonlight and reflected glow from the headlights revealed a broad, hairy chest. My eyes traveled upward, past shoulders as wide as a doorframe, to a face that was both familiar and utterly alien. Large brown eyes stared back at me, intelligent, assessing, cautious. I froze. It froze. For 3 eternal seconds, we stared at each other in the darkness. The creature stood upright on 2 legs, its posture unmistakably bipedal. Standing at least 3 feet taller than my 5'11" frame, it was covered head to toe in dark hair. Not fur, hair. Longer around the shoulders and chest, shorter on the face and hands. Those hands hung at its sides, massive things with visible fingers. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand upright for that long. They don't have eyes that look at you with recognition and assessment. They don't have shoulders and a chest that tapers to a waist. Before I could react, before I could even draw breath to scream, the creature bolted. It turned and ran deeper into the forest, moving upright on 2 legs with a strange, fluid gait that ate up distance with terrifying efficiency. Not the awkward, lumbering run of a bear on its hind legs, but the purposeful stride of a bipedal being accustomed to moving that way. I ran back to the truck, stumbling over roots and nearly falling twice. My heart hammered in my chest, and my breath came in short, painful gasps. I reached the truck, yanked open the door, and jumped inside, slamming it shut and hitting the lock button. "Mark, what's wrong?" Rachel's voice seemed to come from a great distance. The children stirred in the back seat, disturbed by my violent return. "I saw something," I managed to say through my gasping breaths. I grabbed the CB radio from the dash. "Dad, you copy? Dad, come in." After a moment of static, my father's voice crackled through the speaker. "What's up, son? You all settled in?" "Dad, there's something out here. Big, really big, hairy, standing on 2 legs." My voice sounded strange even to myself, high and tight with fear. A pause. "A bear?" "No, not a bear. It ran away on 2 legs, didn't drop to all 4s. It was looking at me, Dad. It had eyes that were watching me, thinking." Another pause. "You sure about this, Mark?" "I'm sure. It was at least 8, maybe 9 feet tall, covered in hair." "All right, son. We're pulling in now. Stay in the truck." I saw my father's headlights cutting through the darkness as he maneuvered his truck and trailer into the campsite next to ours. Once parked, he approached our vehicle cautiously, carrying his flashlight and the revolver he always brought on camping trips. Dad tapped on the window, and I unlocked the doors. "Show me where," he said simply. I pointed to the tree line. "Over there, behind that big pine." Dad nodded and walked toward the spot, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I followed, gathering my courage. Rachel watched anxiously from the truck. We found the spot where I'd been standing. The ground showed signs of disturbance, broken twigs, displaced pine needles. Dad shined his light deeper into the forest, the beam insufficient to penetrate the dense woods more than 30 or 40 feet. "You see anything?" I asked. "No tracks that I can make out. Ground's too hard and covered with pine needles." We stood there for several minutes, listening to the forest. Nothing seemed out of place now, just the normal sounds of a woodland night. "Let's get back to the vehicles," Dad finally said. "We'll sort this out in the morning." As the initial shock wore off, embarrassment began to take its place. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe exhaustion had played tricks on my eyes. Why had I panicked and run instead of standing my ground or trying to get a better look? We returned to the trucks. Rachel and the kids had fallen back asleep, the brief excitement forgotten in their exhaustion. "You want to drive somewhere else?" Dad asked quietly. I considered it, then shook my head. "No, we're all too tired to go anywhere else tonight." "All right then, let's get some sleep. I'll keep the revolver handy." Dad returned to his vehicle, and I climbed back into our truck. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves kept me alert and watchful. I stayed awake nearly until sunrise, hoping and simultaneously dreading that the creature might return. It never did. Morning came with bright sunshine and the cheerful calls of birds. The forest that had seemed so threatening in the darkness now looked peaceful and inviting. We set up camp, cooked breakfast, and went about our day. I told Rachel more details about what I'd seen, but even to my own ears, the story sounded less convincing in the daylight. The rest of our camping trip passed without incident. We hiked, fished, and enjoyed the beauty of the Three Sisters Mountains. But I never ventured into the woods alone, and I kept watching the tree line, half expecting to see those intelligent brown eyes staring back at me. We completed our journey to Washington State the next day. I tried to put the incident behind me, dismissing it as a tired mind playing tricks, but I couldn't forget those eyes. Almost exactly a year later, in late May of 1981, I found myself in a situation that brought it all rushing back. I'd driven up to Republic in Ferry County for work, a construction job that would last about a week. The area was heavily wooded, reminding me somewhat of the Oregon campground from the previous year. On my third night there, driving back to my motel after grabbing dinner in town, my car broke down on a lonely stretch of road about 5 miles from Republic. The engine simply died. No warning, no sputtering, just sudden silence. I coasted to the shoulder, tried the ignition several times, and checked under the hood. Nothing obvious. This was before cell phones, so I had two choices: wait for a passing car or walk into town. After 30 minutes without seeing a single vehicle, I decided to walk. The night was clear and cool, with a bright moon illuminating the road. The pavement stretched ahead of me, a pale ribbon cutting through dense forest. As I started walking, I checked my watch, 9:45 p.m. At a steady pace, I could reach town in about an hour and a half. The first mile passed uneventfully. I was alert but relaxed, enjoying the quiet and the moonlight. Then I heard it, a sound from the woods to my right, a branch snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through undergrowth. I stopped and listened. The movement stopped too. "Hello?" I called out. "Someone there?" No response, just the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. I resumed walking, picking up my pace slightly. After about 20 steps, I heard it again. Movement in the woods, keeping pace with me. I stopped. It stopped. "Who's there?" I called again, my voice sharper now. Still no answer. For the next half mile, this pattern continued. Walking, hearing movement, stopping, silence. Whatever was following me was large enough to make substantial noise, but coordinated enough to match my pace and stop when I stopped. My mind flashed back to Oregon, the eyes, the height, the hair. No, I told myself, not again. It's probably just a deer or an elk, curious about the human walking along the road. As I rounded a bend in the road, the wind shifted, blowing from the forest toward me. That's when I caught it. That same distinctive smell from a year before. Musky, wild, oppressive. Not the scent of any animal I knew, yet undeniably alive and present. My heart rate doubled instantly. I stopped walking and faced the woods. "I know you're there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I can smell you." Silence. Then a deliberate snap of a branch, like something wanted me to know it was there. I'd been scared in Oregon. Now I was terrified. The road stretched empty in both directions. The nearest house was at least 2 miles away. and something was watching me from the darkness between the trees. For the next 20 minutes, I experienced what I can only describe as being hunted. The creature, and I was now certain it was the same type of creature I'd encountered in Oregon, paced me from within the tree line. Sometimes it would move ahead of me, sometimes it would drop behind. Occasionally it would cross the road behind or ahead of me, always staying just out of clear sight in the shadows. Once I caught a glimpse of movement, a large, dark shape shifting between trees. Another time, I heard what sounded like breathing, deep and controlled, not the panting of a winded animal. I kept walking, maintaining as steady a pace as I could on legs that threatened to give out from under me. I talked out loud, telling myself that people did that to scare away bears. "I see you," I lied. "I know what you are. I'm just passing through, not here to bother you." After what seemed like an eternity, I noticed the sounds growing more distant. The presence, that feeling of being watched, gradually faded. Whatever had been tracking me had apparently lost interest or decided I wasn't a threat. Or perhaps it had simply gathered whatever information it was seeking. When I finally saw the lights of Republic in the distance, I nearly collapsed with relief. I reached the first gas station on the edge of town, went inside, and called the local mechanic from the payphone. The clerk looked at me strangely. I must have appeared shell-shocked. "You okay, mister?" he asked. "Yeah," I managed. "Car broke down back on the county road." "That's a long walk in the dark," he said. "Lots of wildlife out there." I just nodded. "Yeah, lots of wildlife." The mechanic agreed to pick me up and tow my car in the morning. I spent the night at the nearby motel, lying awake, replaying both encounters in my mind. The similarities were unmistakable: the size, the smell, the intelligence behind the actions. Both times the creature had observed me, but hadn't approached directly. Both times it had shown awareness and purpose rather than random animal behavior. And both times it had eventually left me alone, apparently satisfied with whatever assessment it had made. In the morning light, as I waited for the mechanic, I tried again to rationalize what I'd experienced. But I couldn't dismiss the evidence of my senses or the identical nature of two encounters hundreds of miles apart. I'd spent those 20 minutes on that dark road being studied by something that walked on two legs, something that thought, something that made decisions, something that, for whatever reason, had chosen to watch rather than approach, something that wasn't supposed to exist. I never told the mechanic about my encounter. I never reported either incident to any authority. Who would believe me? What would I say? That I'd been stalked by a Bigfoot, that I'd locked eyes with a creature from campfire stories. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. I know what I felt. And I know with absolute certainty that twice in my life I encountered an intelligent bipedal being that observed me with purpose and intent. I don't go camping anymore, and I always carry a flashlight. Story 12. I never thought I'd be driving back to Spencer with a sense of dread. The familiar country roads that wound through patches of dense woodland normally filled me with nostalgia, but today something felt different. My sons, Bobby and Jake, dozed in the back seat, unaware of the tension building in my shoulders as we approached my parents' property. "Mom, are we there yet?" Jake mumbled, half asleep. "Almost, honey. Another 10 minutes. The truth was, I'd been putting off this visit. The phone calls with Mom had grown strange over the past few months. Dad rarely came to the phone anymore, and Mom spoke in hushed tones about troubles in the garden. I chalked it up to old age. Dad was 78 now, Mom 75, but something in her voice unsettled me. The Wilson property came into view as we rounded the final bend. The 2-story farmhouse stood just as it always had. White paint a little more chipped than I remembered. The barn needed a new coat of red. But it was the surrounding land that caught my eye immediately. Something was different. "Boys, we're here," I announced, pulling into the gravel driveway. Mom appeared on the porch before I'd even cut the engine. She looked smaller somehow, more frail than during Christmas. Her smile seemed forced as she waved. "Linda, boys, come give your grandma a hug." The next hour passed in the usual flurry of arrival activities, carrying in luggage, accepting Mom's insistence we needed lemonade and cookies, the boys racing to see if Grandpa had any new tools in the workshop. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Dad was quieter than usual, watching the tree line beyond the property with narrowed eyes. It wasn't until after dinner, when the boys were playing video games in the guest room, that I got my first real clue something was wrong. I stepped onto the back porch for some air and noticed the garden. The sprawling rows of gooseberry and currant bushes that had been a fixture of my childhood summers were gone, completely gone, with only freshly turned soil marking where they'd been. And the pear tree, the massive, 100-year-old tree that had fed generations of Wilsons, stood stripped bare. Not a single fruit remained on its branches, despite it being early July, when it should have been laden with growing pears. I walked across the yard, my feet crunching on the dry grass. The closer I got to the tree, the more I noticed something else. Deep indentations in the soil around its base. They weren't regular patterns like you'd see from farming equipment. They looked like footprints, but not like any footprints I'd ever seen. When I returned inside, Mom was washing dishes, her thin shoulders hunched. "Mom, what happened to the garden? And the pear tree looks completely stripped." Her hands stilled in the soapy water. Without turning, she said, "Someone took all the fruit overnight. Ask your father about it." "Someone? You mean like teenagers or something?" "Ask your father, Linda. He's in his study." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, reminiscent of feelings I hadn't experienced since childhood. Those nights when I'd lie awake, certain something was moving outside my window. Dad's study was at the end of the hall, a small room packed with books and mementos from his 20 years as Spencer's mayor. The door was ajar, and I found him sitting in his leather chair, cleaning his old hunting rifle. He didn't look up when I entered. "Dad, what's going on with the garden? Mum said to ask you." His hands paused on the rifle. For several seconds he said nothing. When he finally looked up, I was startled by the fear in his eyes. "Had to dig them all up, every last bush." His voice was gruff, almost defensive. "Going to cut down the pear tree too this weekend." "But why? Those bushes have been there my entire life." Dad set the rifle aside and rubbed his weathered face. "Found footprints, big ones, all around the garden and the tree." "Footprints? Like an animal?" "Not an animal, Linda, not like any animal I know." He leaned forward. "They're feet, human-shaped, but, Christ, Linda, they're huge. My size 10s don't even fill half of one print." My throat went dry. "You mean like a person? Someone with big feet?" "I mean one of those Bigfoot creatures. I know how it sounds, but I'm not losing my mind here." He stood up suddenly, moving to the window to peer out at the darkening yard. "It's been coming at night. Stripped the entire pear tree in one visit. Took nearly all the berries, too." I sank into the chair opposite his desk. "Dad, that's crazy. You think I don't know how it sounds?" His voice rose slightly before he caught himself, glancing toward the door. "Your mother doesn't sleep anymore, sits up half the night listening, says she hears them moving around outside." "Them?" The word slipped out before I could stop it. Dad turned back to me. "There's more than one. I've found different sizes of prints. A big one, and at least one smaller." My heart hammered against my ribs. The memories I'd suppressed for years threatened to surface. The shapes I'd glimpsed outside my childhood bedroom window. The heavy footsteps that definitely weren't deer. The inexplicable silences in the forest when I'd play near the creek. When did this start? Getting bad after Rex died. Dad returned to his chair, shoulders slumped. Rex had been their German Shepherd Golden Retriever mix. a beloved presence on the property for 14 years until his passing 3 months ago. I think that dog kept them away, or at least farther from the house. Now there's nothing to stop them from coming right up to the garden. Have you told anyone else? Dad's laugh was bitter. Who would I tell? Sheriff Donovan, the newspaper. I was mayor of this town, Linda. People already whisper about us Wilsons and our strange ways. Your grandfather fought those rumors his whole life. I knew what he meant. The Wilson property had a reputation in Spencer, passed down in hushed tones at the diner and the feed store. Strange lights, weird sounds, livestock acting peculiar whenever they passed our fence line. So your solution is to destroy the garden, cut down a 100-year-old pear tree. I'm taking away what's bringing them here. Dad's voice hardened. What would you have me do? Sit here night after night knowing those things are 20 yards from where your mother sleeps? I had no answer. The setting sun cast long shadows across the study floor, and I suddenly felt very cold despite the July heat. I'm going to check on the boys, I said, standing. Dad nodded, already reaching for his rifle again. Don't tell them about this. No need to scare them. That night, I couldn't sleep. The guest room window faced the back of the property, giving me a clear view of the abandoned garden plot and the skeletal branches of the pear tree in the moonlight. The boys slept soundly in the twin beds across the room, Jake's soft snores punctuating the night silence. I kept thinking about what Dad had said, about the footprints, about Rex keeping them away. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, the back door opening and closing softly. Moving to the window, I saw Dad's figure crossing the yard, shotgun cradled in his arms. He positioned himself behind the old oak stump near the garden's edge, a perfect vantage point to watch the tree line. For an hour, nothing happened. The forest remained still, the only movement coming from branches swaying in the light summer breeze. I was about to return to bed when the air changed. The crickets stopped chirping. Every night sound died simultaneously, creating a vacuum of silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Dad tensed visibly, raising the shotgun slightly. That's when I saw it. At first, just a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, moving at the forest's edge. Tall, impossibly tall, and broad-shouldered. It moved with surprising grace for its size, stepping into the clearing with deliberate caution. Even from the distance of my second-story window, I could tell this was no man in a costume. The proportions were wrong, arms too long, legs too thick. It moved like something that belonged in the forest, natural and fluid despite its massive frame. Dad remained frozen behind the stump. I don't think he'd anticipated actually encountering one of the creatures. The shotgun in his hands trembled visibly. The creature approached the pear tree, reaching up to examine the branches. Finding them bare, it made a sound, low and rumbling, carrying across the yard with surprising clarity. Not aggressive, but unmistakably disappointed. Then it turned toward the house. I dropped to the floor, heart pounding so loudly I feared it might wake the boys. When I gathered the courage to peer over the windowsill again, the creature was standing in the middle of the yard, looking directly at my window. It knew I was watching. For several excruciating seconds, we remained locked in this strange standoff. Me crouched behind the window, it standing in plain moonlight. Then it raised one massive hand, palm outward, in what seemed like a greeting. Before I could process this, movement at the forest edge caught my attention. A second figure emerged, smaller than the first, but still unmistakably of the same species. More fluid in its movements, perhaps younger, it approached the larger one with obvious deference. Dad chose that moment to stand, the shotgun now aimed squarely at the larger creature. "Get off my property!" His voice carried clearly through the night. Both creatures turned toward him. The smaller one immediately retreated several steps, but the larger held its ground, regarding my father with what I could only interpret as curiosity. "I said get!" Dad pumped the shotgun, the sound like a thunderclap in the silent night. The larger creature made a sound then, not a roar or growl, but a series of complex vocalizations that rose and fell in distinct patterns. It was communicating, I realized with a shock. Actually communicating. Then, with one final look toward my window, it turned and walked back toward the forest, the smaller one following closely. They disappeared into the trees with barely a sound. Far quieter than anything of their size should be able to move. Dad remained in position for another 20 minutes before finally returning to the house. I crept back to bed, mind racing with what I'd witnessed. The next morning, I found Dad at the kitchen table before dawn, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "You saw them," he said. Not a question. I nodded, pouring myself coffee with shaking hands. "Has this been happening every night?" "Not every night. 2, maybe 3 times a week since Rex died. They didn't seem aggressive." Dad's eyes narrowed. "Don't start with that, Linda. They're wild animals, unpredictable. But I'm cutting down that pear tree today. End of discussion." I bit my tongue, recognizing the stubborn set of his jaw from countless childhood arguments. Instead, I asked, "Have you noticed anything else missing besides the fruit?" His hesitation told me everything before he even spoke. The garden vegetables, tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, and... He stopped, looking embarrassed. "And what?" "Your mother's honey. She keeps those hives past the old barn, found them opened and emptied last week. Not broken, mind you. Opened. Like someone knew exactly how to lift those frames out." The implications sent a shiver down my spine. "Dad, these aren't just animals. I don't care what they are. I want them gone." After breakfast, I left Dad with the boys and walked out to examine the garden myself. In the morning light, I could see the footprints clearly, massive impressions in the soft soil, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide. Just as Dad had said, his foot would barely cover half of one print. I continued past the stripped pear tree to the edge of the property where the forest began. Something drew me forward, a half-remembered instinct from childhood. 20 yards into the trees, I found what I was looking for. Broken branches at a height no deer or bear could reach, forming a distinct trail heading deeper into the forest. Further in, I discovered a small clearing I didn't recognize from my childhood explorations. In the center lay a neat pile of pear tree branches, stacked with obvious purpose. Surrounding it were hulled gooseberry stems and currant remains, not scattered as animals would leave them, but gathered deliberately. This wasn't random foraging. This was methodical harvesting. As I turned to head back, something caught my eye, a rock formation that didn't look natural. 3 stones had been stacked in a small tower, the type of marker humans might leave to indicate a trail. Except no hiking paths ran through this section of forest. I heard Bobby calling my name from the direction of the house and hurried back, not wanting to worry anyone with my absence. The rest of the day passed in tense activity. Dad enlisted Bobby and Jake's help in clearing branches from the pear tree while he worked the chainsaw. I watched from the porch, heartsick as the ancient tree came down piece by piece. Mom stayed inside, refusing to witness it. That evening, after the boys were engrossed in a board game with Grandma, I cornered Dad in the garage where he was storing the larger sections of trunk. "Those creatures have been coming here my entire life, haven't they?" I asked without preamble. Dad froze, a piece of wood suspended in his hands. "What are you talking about?" "I used to see them too, when I was a kid, outside my window sometimes." He set the wood down slowly. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" "I thought they were dreams, or that you'd tell me I was making things up." I leaned against the workbench. "But they've always been here, haven't they? Even before Rex died." Dad sighed, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. "Your grandfather used to talk about them, called them the quiet neighbors. Said as long as we respected certain boundaries, they'd respect ours." "What boundaries?" No hunting on the North Ridge. No cutting trees past the creek line, and always leaving some of the harvest, apples, berries, whatever we grew. He shook his head. I thought it was superstitious nonsense. When I took over the property, I stopped following those old rules, and that's when people in town started talking about the Wilson place being strange. Things happened. Livestock went missing. Equipment got moved or damaged. He ran a hand through his thinning hair. Your grandfather warned me, but I was too proud to listen. Eventually I figured it out and went back to the old ways. Things settled down after that. So what changed now, besides Rex? Dad was quiet for a long moment. I think there are more of them than there used to be. Or maybe they're hungrier. I don't know. That night I lay awake again, watching the forest. The boys slept soundly, untroubled by the adult concerns weighing on me. Around midnight, Mom slipped into the room and sat on the edge of my bed. "You've seen them," she whispered. I nodded in the darkness. "Your father is scared, not for himself, but for me, for you and the boys." Her hand found mine. "He doesn't understand them like your grandfather did." "Did you know all these years?" "Of course I knew. A woman knows what walks on her land." She squeezed my hand. "They're not evil, Linda. They're just different, living their lives alongside ours. Dad cut down their food source. They'll be angry." Mum shook her head. "They don't think like that. They'll move on, find food elsewhere. But this land has been part of their territory for longer than it's been ours." Before leaving, she pressed something into my palm, a small leather pouch. "Your grandfather made this. Said it was a peace offering, if they ever came too close to the house." Inside the pouch were dried berries, nuts, and what looked like herbs bound with twine. "Put it on the stump where the pear tree was," she said, "just in case." After she left, I slipped out of bed and downstairs. The night air was cool against my skin as I crossed the yard to the freshly cut stump. I placed the pouch in the center, feeling slightly foolish, but compelled to honor my grandfather's wisdom. As I turned to go back inside, the silence fell again, that unnatural quiet that preceded their arrival. I stopped, heart racing, but didn't run. From the forest edge, the larger creature emerged. It moved with the same deliberate grace as before, approaching the stump where I stood. I could have run, should have run, but something held me in place. It stopped 10 feet away, close enough now that I could see details I'd missed from the window. Its face was flat, with deep-set eyes under a prominent brow. Not human, but not quite animal either. Something in between, with an intelligence that radiated from its gaze. It looked at me, then at the pouch on the stump. With movements surprisingly delicate for hands so large, it picked up the offering, bringing it to its nose to smell. Then it did something I never expected. It reached into a makeshift pouch of its own, fashioned from what appeared to be woven plant fibers, and removed something. It placed this item on the stump, where my grandfather's pouch had been. A simple exchange, a gesture as old as time. Without waiting to see what I would do, it turned and disappeared back into the forest, faster and quieter than something its size should be able to move. I approached the stump cautiously. Sitting there was a perfectly formed object about the size of my palm, a carving made from a single piece of wood depicting a bear. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with details no hurried work could achieve. I took it inside, this gift from the forest neighbors. I didn't show it to Dad. Some understandings aren't meant to be shared with those not ready to accept them. The next morning, we packed to leave earlier than planned. Dad seemed relieved we were going, though he tried to hide it. As we loaded the car, I noticed Mum had placed baskets of vegetables from her kitchen garden at the forest edge, a silent continuation of her own relationship with the quiet neighbors. "Will you be okay?" I asked Dad as we prepared to leave. "We'll be fine." He tried to sound confident. I've ordered a new dog. German Shepherd. Arrives next week." I hugged him tightly, feeling the frailty in his once strong frame. "Call me more often, okay? And maybe don't cut down anything else without talking to Mom first." He grumbled something non-committal, but I saw him glance at the forest with less hostility than before. As we drove away, I checked the rearview mirror. Mum stood waving on the porch, Dad beside her with one arm around her shoulders. Behind them, the Wilson property stretched toward the tree line. Our land, yet not entirely ours. The wooden bear carving sat on the dashboard where I'd placed it. The boys had asked about it, and I'd simply said it was a gift from an old neighbor. Not entirely a lie. Some visits reveal more than family secrets. Sometimes they uncover the thin boundaries between worlds that exist side by side, separated only by our willingness to see. Story 13. I remember the air that day, cool for September, with just enough breeze to make the leaves whisper. My friend Jenny and I had picked a perfect spot along the rocky river, perched on this natural rock wall about 8 feet above the water. The fishing had been decent, nothing spectacular, but enough to keep us interested. We'd packed sandwiches, a couple beers, and all the patience 2 working mothers could muster for a rare day off. The Rocky River Reservation was our escape, just far enough from Cleveland proper to feel like we'd left the city behind, but close enough that we could be home before the kids got back from school. Jenny had suggested it because her uncle used to take her there as a kid. Best smallmouth bass fishing in the county, she'd promised. We'd been there maybe 3 hours when a group of deer, 5, maybe 6 of them, crossed the river about 50 yards downstream. They moved with that cautious grace they have, stepping through the shallow water, pausing to check their surroundings before continuing into the woods on our side. "That's a good sign," Jenny said, reeling in her line to check her bait. "Means it's quiet here. Peaceful." I nodded, watching the last deer disappear into the tree line. "Sure is pretty out here." I remember checking my watch, 2:15 p.m. The sun was high enough that it filtered through the trees in patches, creating those dappled patterns on the water. I just cast my line again when I noticed something moving in the woods, directly across the narrow part of the river. "Look," I said, nodding toward the movement. "Deer must have doubled back." Jenny squinted. "Doesn't look like deer to me." I kept watching, thinking at first it was just branches swaying in the wind. But there was a pattern to it. Deliberate movement. Whatever it was stood upright among the trees, tall enough to be reaching for leaves about 7 or 8 feet up. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice suddenly dry. "Probably just a guy hiking," Jenny said. But she'd stopped fishing too, both of us now staring at the movement across the water. The thing was just 20 feet away, on the opposite bank, partially obscured by foliage. I remember so clearly how the sun broke through the canopy at that exact moment, illuminating 2 reddish-orange eyes that reflected the light like a cat's might. Those eyes locked directly on mine. My stomach dropped. I've never felt anything like it. That instant, visceral recognition that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. "Jenny," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the shape, "do you see that?" But Jenny was already scrambling to her feet, grabbing her tackle box. "Fuck this," she hissed. "I'm out!" I heard her footsteps retreating up the path behind me, but I couldn't move. It was like my brain had short-circuited, unable to process what I was seeing as a large black figure began stepping out from behind the trees. It emerged slowly, deliberately. First a massive shoulder covered in black fur, then the full torso. It stood upright on 2 legs at the forest edge, now completely visible. The thing was huge, easily over 6 feet tall, maybe closer to 7. The black fur covered its entire body, shorter on its face, but longer around the shoulders, like a mane. Its skin underneath looked dark, almost grey-black where I could see it on the face. The brow was pronounced, heavy over those terrible orange-red eyes that never left mine. What struck me most was the width of it. I've been around plenty of big men. My brother played college football and my husband's not small. But this thing was massive through the chest and shoulders, twice as wide as any man I'd ever seen. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stare as this impossible creature stood watching me from across 20 feet of river water. It didn't make a sound, just watched me, as motionless as I was. 5 seconds, 10. Time stretched in the strangest way. Then it shifted its weight, and that tiny movement broke my paralysis. I grabbed my fishing rod and tackle box in one motion and ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, across the open field behind our fishing spot, toward the parking lot where Jenny had already started her car. Halfway across the field, my foot caught on something, a root, a rock, I don't know, and I went down hard. My fishing gear scattered, and I felt a warm spread of wetness down my legs. I'd pissed myself from pure fear. I didn't even care. All I could think was that it was coming after me, that those hands, because they were hands, not paws, would grab me from behind. I scrambled up without looking back, abandoned my gear, and sprinted the rest of the way to Jenny's blue Honda. She'd pulled up to the edge of the lot, engine running, door open on my side. Get in, she screamed, and I threw myself into the passenger seat. She peeled out before I even closed the door. What the fuck was that? She kept saying over and over, hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel. What the fuck was that? I couldn't answer. My teeth were chattering even though it wasn't cold. I looked down and realized I'd wet myself, my jeans soaked through. I don't know, I finally managed. I don't know what I saw. Jenny drove us straight to her house. It was closer than mine, and made me take a shower while she found me clean clothes. Her husband was at work, and her kids still at school, which was a blessing. I don't think either of us wanted to explain what had happened. After I'd showered and changed, we sat at her kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee that neither of us touched. I didn't see it clearly, Jenny said finally. I just saw something big and dark and I ran. I wasn't sticking around. It was standing on 2 legs, I said. My voice sounded strange even to me. It was covered in black fur. It had a face, not like an animal exactly, but not human either. Jenny shook her head. I'm never going back there, not ever. Me neither, I agreed. But of course, life doesn't stop for Sasquatch sightings. I went home, picked up my kids from the bus stop, made dinner, helped with homework, all the while feeling like I was moving through a dream. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those reddish-orange eyes staring at me. My husband Dan came home late from his shift at the plant. I hadn't told him anything yet. What would I even say? But as he got ready for bed, I knew I needed to tell someone who wasn't Jenny. Something happened today, I said as he pulled back the covers. Yeah? Good fishing? He wasn't really listening, already half asleep on his feet. I saw something in the woods at Rocky River. Something not normal. That got his attention. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at me with that face he makes when he thinks I'm being dramatic. What? Like a bear? There aren't any bears around Cleveland, Mel. Not a bear, I said. It was standing on 2 legs. It had red eyes. Dan snorted. So what, you saw Bigfoot? Come on. I'm serious, Dan. It was watching me. It was right there across the river. He sighed, that long, suffering sigh that made me want to scream. You and Jenny probably saw some guy in a hunting get-up, or a shadow that looked weird. Jenny didn't even see it clearly. She ran. But I saw it, Dan. I saw its face. He patted my leg through the blanket. Okay, honey. If you say so, just don't go telling people you saw Bigfoot in the Cleveland metro parks. They'll think you're nuts. I turned away from him, anger replacing some of the fear. Forget it. 2 days later, Dan had his buddy Mike over to watch football. I was in the kitchen, half listening to their conversation over the game, when I heard my name. Mel thinks she saw Bigfoot up at Rocky River, Dan was saying, laughing. Can you believe that shit? I froze, humiliation washing over me. I was about to storm in there when Mike's response stopped me cold. Rocky River Reservation? No shit. His voice had none of the mockery Dan's had. Kayla saw something up there last month. Dan's laughter cut off. What? Yeah, my girlfriend. She was running the trail early one morning. Said she saw some huge ape-looking thing running on all fours through the woods. She thought it was a big dog at first, but said it was way too big. She hauled ass out of there. There was silence from the living room. I stepped into the doorway, seeing Dan's confused face and Mike's serious one. She saw it too? I asked. Mike looked over at me. She was too scared to tell anyone at first. Thought people would laugh at her. I wasn't laughing, Dan said quickly, but we both knew he had been. Where exactly was she? I asked, sitting down. Same area, along the river. She runs that 5-mile loop a couple times a week. Or she did. She won't go back now. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. 2 sightings in the same area within weeks of each other. I got out of bed around midnight and went to our computer. With Dan snoring in the bedroom, I searched for Bigfoot sightings Ohio and fell down a rabbit hole I never expected. Turns out, northeastern Ohio has a long history of Bigfoot sightings. The Cuyahoga Valley, the whole emerald necklace of parks around Cleveland, dozens of reports over the years. I found a website run by some research group that collected accounts, and there it was. Multiple sightings in the Rocky River Reservation dating back decades. I read about how these creatures reportedly follow waterways, using rivers as travel corridors, how they shadow deer herds for food, how the steep ravines and old-growth forests along Rocky River provide perfect cover, enough wilderness to move through unseen, but close enough to civilization for occasional sightings. I read until my eyes burned, until the sky started to lighten outside our window. None of it made scientific sense. A giant, undiscovered primate living in Ohio. Impossible. Yet I knew what I'd seen. A week passed, then 2. I tried to forget about it, to convince myself I'd seen a bear or a man in a weird coat or anything other than what I thought I'd seen, but those eyes haunted me, the way it had stood there, watching me with what looked like intelligence. Jenny refused to talk about it. When I brought it up over coffee, she shut me down. I don't care what it was, Mel. I'm not discussing it. But I couldn't let it go. 3 weeks after the sighting, I told Dan I was going shopping. Instead, I drove back to Rocky River Reservation. I don't know what compelled me. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I parked in the same lot, but didn't bring fishing gear this time. Just my phone and a small pair of binoculars I took from Dan's hunting stuff. It was a Wednesday afternoon, the park nearly empty, except for a couple of joggers and an old man walking his dog. I didn't go back to our fishing spot. Instead, I stuck to the main trail, my heart pounding every time the wind moved the branches. I walked for almost an hour, jumpy at every sound, before I realized how stupid I was being. What was I hoping to accomplish? To see it again? And then what? I was about to turn back when I noticed something on the trail ahead, a pile of droppings that didn't look like deer scat or dog waste. It was larger, piled in a way that seemed deliberate. Next to it, pressed into a patch of mud, was what looked like a footprint. I approached slowly, my mouth dry. The print was huge, at least 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toe impressions. It looked almost human, but wider, deeper. I took out my phone with shaking hands and snapped several pictures. A twig snapped in the woods to my left. I whipped around, nearly dropping my phone. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth. But the hair on my arms stood up. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting it. Silence. Then a rustling, deeper in the woods. Something moving away. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and walked quickly back toward the parking lot, breaking into a run for the last quarter-mile. When I got to my car, I sat there with the doors locked, staring at the photos on my phone. The footprint was clearly visible. Not a bear, not a man, not anything I could explain away. I haven't shown the pictures to anyone, not even Dan. I'm not sure what to do with them. I've thought about contacting one of those Bigfoot research groups, but part of me wants to keep this private. My own impossible encounter. I still dream about those eyes. Sometimes I wake up in the night, certain that if I looked out our bedroom window, I'd see that figure standing in our yard, watching me. Dan thinks I'm having anxiety attacks. Maybe I am. But I know what I saw on that September afternoon. I know those eyes locked with mine, across 20 feet of river water. I know something lives in those woods that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind moves through the trees around our house, I wonder if it remembers me too. Story 14. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up before my brain could process why. Something wasn't right. The Idaho wilderness stretched around us, vast and indifferent, but I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. My name's Jackson Miller. I've been guiding in these mountains for 15 years. August 2018 started like any other pre-season setup. Me and two other guides, Hank and Daryl, were packing camps and hayloads before hunting season kicked off. This particular day found us at a trailhead on the northeast edge of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. Most folks don't realize how isolated this place is, arguably the most remote area in the lower 48 states. No roads, no cell service, nothing but mountains and forest for miles. "Need a break," Daryl said, wiping sweat from his forehead. We'd been working since sunrise, hauling supplies and setting up stations. Horses need rest too. I nodded. The August sun beat down hard despite the elevation. "Let's head up to that ridge. Good view from there." We secured the horses and hiked about 15 minutes uphill. The spot was perfect. A small clearing with a natural rock bench and a view that stretched across miles of untouched wilderness. I pulled out beef jerky and a water bottle from my pack. Daryl did the same, and we sat there in comfortable silence, the kind that develops between men who work together in remote places. I finished my lunch and leaned back, scanning the landscape out of habit. That's when I noticed it. About 25 yards downhill, a small grove of 6 large ponderosa pines stood clustered together. Between us and the grove was a rock slide area, mostly clear of vegetation, creating a perfect sightline to the trees. Behind one of the larger trunks, something moved, something dark and deliberate. At first I didn't say anything. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the heat was playing tricks. But no. There it was again. A dark object, moving slowly behind one of the trees, as if trying to stay hidden while observing us. "Daryl," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the spot. "You see that? Down by that grove of trees?" Daryl squinted. "What am I looking for?" "Something behind that big pine on the left, moving real slow." My mind ran through the possibilities. Bear was my first thought, but the position wasn't right. Whatever I'd seen was high up the trunk, not on all fours, too tall for a bear standing upright. Seconds ticked by. I stood up slowly, expecting whatever it was to continue past the tree, but nothing appeared. The forest had gone quiet too. No birds, no rustling, just silence. "I'm going to check it out," I said, keeping my voice low. "Whatever I saw has to still be there. Nowhere else for it to go without us seeing it move across that open slide area." "You sure that's smart?" Daryl asked, standing up beside me. I wasn't sure at all, but 15 years of guiding had built a certain confidence in me. "Just want to see what we're dealing with." I took my first step downhill toward the grove. That's when it happened. Behind us, no more than 20 or 30 yards up the slope, an extraordinarily loud sound erupted from the woods. It hit me like a physical force, not an animal sound I'd ever heard before. Not a whoop or a scream or a howl. It was Something else, like a wood instrument mixed with speech in a different language. A deep, resonant sound that seemed to fill the clearing. I froze mid-step. Daryl grabbed my shoulder. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. We couldn't see up the steep slope behind us, but whatever made that sound was close. Too close. My heart hammered against my ribs. I'd spent my adult life in these mountains. I'd encountered black bears, grizzlies, mountain lions, elk and moose. I knew their sounds, their behaviors. This was something else entirely. "Let's get back to the horses," I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Normally I'd have investigated both the figure by the tree and the sound, but something primitive in my brain was screaming danger. We had no weapons, not even a hunting knife between us. Just two men, miles from anywhere, with something large and unknown nearby. We didn't run. Running triggers chase instincts in predators, but we moved quickly, deliberately, back the way we'd come. Neither of us spoke until we reached the horses. They were agitated, pulling at their leads, eyes wide. "They heard it too," Daryl said, stroking his gelding's neck. "Yeah." I checked my watch. Just past 1:30 p.m., broad daylight. We should head back to base camp. As we mounted up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I'd been curious about Sasquatch phenomena for years, read the reports, listened to the stories from old-timers and native folks. I'd always kept an open mind but maintained healthy skepticism. Now, with my heart still racing and the strange sound echoing in my memory, I wasn't so sure anymore. We rode in silence for about 20 minutes before Daryl spoke. "You think that was a person? Maybe another guide or a hiker?" I shook my head. "No way. We're miles from the nearest trail access, and that sound, that wasn't human, Daryl." "Wasn't any animal I know either?" "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." The horses remained jumpy the whole ride back. We arrived at base camp just before 3 p.m. Hank was there organizing supplies. "You two look like you've seen a ghost," he said, looking up from his work. I tied my horse to the hitching post and took a deep breath. Not a ghost, but something. We told Hank what happened. He listened without interrupting, his weathered face giving away nothing. "You sure it wasn't a bear?" he asked when we finished. "Behind the tree?" "Maybe," I admitted. "But that sound wasn't a bear, or anything else I've ever heard in these mountains." Hank nodded slowly. "I heard something strange last season, up near Boulder Creek. Thought it was the wind in the canyon at first, but it wasn't. Never saw anything, though." That night, sitting around the campfire, we discussed what happened. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced those beings were attempting communication. The figure behind the tree had revealed itself just enough to be noticed. Then the vocalization came right when I started to investigate, as if to stop me from getting closer. "Like a warning," Daryl suggested. "Or a greeting," I countered. "Could have hurt us if it wanted to." Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in my tent, replaying the incident, the deliberate movement behind the tree, the impossible sound, the primal fear I'd felt. In 15 years of wilderness work, I'd never experienced anything like it. Morning arrived with fog hanging low in the valley. We had work to do, camps to set up further west. But first, I made a decision. "I want to go back," I told the others over coffee, "to that spot from yesterday." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Why poke the bear, Jackson?" "Need to see it in the daylight. Just a quick look." Daryl sighed but stood up. "I'll go with you." Hank opted to stay with the supplies. This time we took rifles, standard procedure in grizzly country, but now they carried additional comfort. We reached the trailhead by 8 a.m. and tied the horses at the same spot. The morning was cool, birds active in the trees around us. Nothing seemed out of place. We hiked up to the clearing where we'd eaten lunch the day before. In the morning light, it looked smaller, less significant. Just another rocky outcrop in a wilderness full of them. "There's the grove," Daryl pointed downhill to the cluster of ponderosas. We made our way carefully down to the trees. I circled the one where I'd seen the dark figure. No tracks in the needle-covered ground, no broken branches, no hair or scrape marks on the bark. "Nothing," I said, running my hand over the rough trunk. "What did you expect?" Darrell asked. I didn't know. Evidence, I suppose. Something to validate what I'd seen. We climbed back up to the lunch spot and then continued further up the slope to where the sound had come from. The terrain was steep here, thick with underbrush and fallen logs, hard to move through quietly. Again, we found nothing unusual. No tracks, no disturbance in the vegetation that couldn't be explained by deer or elk. "Let's head back," I finally said. As we turned to leave, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small opening between two large boulders, half hidden by a fallen tree. It led into a narrow passage that appeared to continue into the hillside. "Hold up," I said, pointing. Darrell followed my gaze. "That a cave?" "Maybe." I stepped closer, peering into the darkness. "Might explain where our visitor went." The passage was too narrow for a bear. A human could squeeze through sideways, though. "Should we check it out?" Darrell asked. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the dark opening. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to respect the boundary that seemed to have been established yesterday. "No," I decided. "Let's go." We made it back to the horses without incident. As I untied my gelding, a thought occurred to me. "You know what's strange? Apart from us, there's no one within 20 miles of here. No roads, no trails used by tourists, just wilderness." Darrell nodded. "Perfect place to hide, if you didn't want to be found." The rest of August passed without further incidents. We finished setting up the hunting camps, hauled in the last of the supplies, and prepared for the clients who would arrive in September. I didn't return to that specific area again that season, but I thought about it a lot. When I got home in November after the season ended, I started researching. I found reports of similar encounters in the Frank Church wilderness dating back decades. Strange sounds, glimpses of large, dark figures, rocks thrown at camps, always in the most remote areas, away from established trails. What stuck with me most wasn't the fear I'd felt that day, though it had been real enough. It was the sense that the encounter had been deliberate, that whatever was out there had chosen to reveal itself to us, had communicated in its way, had established a boundary. This wasn't a random animal sighting. It felt purposeful. The following spring, before the new season started, I drove out to Salmon, Idaho, and had coffee with Bill Stevens, an 83-year-old former hunting guide who'd worked the Frank Church area for over 50 years. "Heard you had an encounter last season," he said, after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "News travels in small communities." "Maybe," I replied cautiously. Still not sure what it was. Bill nodded, his gnarled hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Seen 'em 3 times myself over the years. Heard 'em more often than that." "Seen what exactly?" I asked. "You know what," he said, fixing me with a steady gaze. "The old ones, the forest people, whatever name you want to give 'em." "Sasquatch?" I said the word quietly. Bill shrugged. "That's what the books call 'em. Locals here have other names." "You believe they're real then?" "Don't matter what I believe. They're there. Been there longer than us." He took a sip of coffee. "My grandfather was Shoshone. He said they've always been in these mountains, said they're people of a sort, not animals. Smart. Prefer to be left alone." I told him about our experience, the figure behind the tree, the strange vocalization, the cave we'd found the next day. Bill listened, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he said, "You did right, leaving that cave alone. They don't take kindly to folks pushing in where they're not wanted." "But what are they?" I asked. "Does it matter?" Bill countered. "World's full of things we don't understand. Always has been." I returned to the Frank Church wilderness that season and every season since. I've never had another encounter like the one in August 2018. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the backcountry, I feel watched. Sometimes I hear wood knocks or strange calls in the distance. But I've never again seen a dark figure hiding behind a tree or heard that impossible sound so close by. I don't know what we encountered that day. I don't know if it was what people call Sasquatch or something else entirely. What I do know is this. The wilderness is vaster and more mysterious than most people realize. In places like the Frank Church, remote, untamed, largely untouched, there are spaces where the modern world hasn't fully penetrated. And in those spaces, perhaps there's room for the unexplained to exist, not as myths or legends, but as flesh and blood, living and breathing, watching us from behind trees and making sounds we don't understand. I keep my rifle closer these days when I'm working deep in the backcountry, but I also keep my mind open. Whatever we encountered that August afternoon, it could have harmed us if it wanted to. Instead, it revealed itself just enough to be noticed, then warned us away. That feels like communication to me, and if something's trying to communicate, I figure the least I can do is listen. Yestai. Night story 15. I couldn't sleep that night. Maybe it was the excitement of opening day, or maybe it was something else. That feeling in your gut when something ain't right. But I'd been waiting all winter for turkey season, so at 3:30 a.m. on that cool April morning in 2016, I got up, made coffee and loaded my truck in the dark. My name's Travis Reynolds. Been hunting since I was old enough to hold a shotgun. This particular farm outside Greenville, Missouri, had been my spot since I was 14, when Dad first brought me out here. 23 years of knowing every ridge, creek and fence line. Or so I thought. The gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled onto the property at 4:46 a.m. I remember checking my watch, calculating how much time I had before first light. The moon hung bright enough that I barely needed my headlamp. I parked in my usual spot, grabbed my 12-gauge Remington, and started hiking toward the East Ridge. Dad always said the turkeys liked to roost on that hillside when the weather turned warm in spring. My boots were still stiff from the waterproofing I'd applied the night before. Each step made a soft squeak against the dew-covered grass. The air felt damp, heavy with morning fog that collected in the low spots. I moved slowly, deliberately, listening more than looking. I reached my first spot by 5:15. The hilltop gave me a good vantage point, and I'd taken birds here before. I settled in against an old oak, arranged my calls and shells within reach, and waited. The woods were quiet except for the occasional chirp of early birds and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. As the black sky faded to grey, I heard it. A gobble, distant but clear, maybe 800 yards away on the opposite side of the property. I checked my watch, 5:34 a.m. The bird sounded again, definitely a tom, and definitely nowhere near where I was sitting. Shit, I muttered. I had two choices, stay put and hope he'd come my way or move toward him. The second gobble made my decision. This bird was hot, ready to go, and I wasn't going to wait for him to change his mind. I gathered my gear and began descending the hill I'd just climbed. My boots slid slightly on the damp grass as I worked my way down toward the dirt access road that cut through the middle of the property. The fog had settled into the low areas, making the visibility poor. I walked with my shotgun broken open, safety always first, just like Dad taught me. The dirt road was muddy from rain earlier in the week. My boots left deep impressions as I moved quickly but quietly, stopping every 100 yards or so to listen. The gobbling continued, still distant but regular now. This tom was looking for hens, and I intended to sound like the most attractive one in these woods. After following the road for about a quarter mile, I turned onto a deer trail that would take me closer to the gobbling. The path narrowed, flanked by thick blackberry bushes, with thorns that caught at my camouflage. I pushed through, feeling the occasional sharp prick through my clothes. The gobbler sounded again, closer now. I was on the right track. The trail began to climb upward, and my breathing got heavier. Sweat, formed under my hat, despite the cool morning. The gobbling was much clearer now, maybe 300 yards away. I slowed my pace, being more careful about noise. The last thing I wanted was to spook this bird after all this effort. As I reached the top of the hill, I saw them, a row of massive white oaks, all downed in the same direction. I'd forgotten about the tornado that hit this area 3 years back. These trees created a natural barrier, their massive trunks lying horizontal with limbs and branches making a tangled mess down the slope toward a draw below. The gobbler sounded again, just beyond this wooden obstacle course. I needed to get through. I approached the first fallen oak, its trunk about 4 feet off the ground. Rather than climbing over and risking noise, I bent down to pass underneath. My vest caught briefly on the rough bark as I ducked under, and I had to twist to free myself. As I straightened up on the other side, something moved. At first I thought it was just branches shifting in the morning breeze. Then I saw it stand. It rose so quickly that my first thought was that I'd spooked a turkey. A big tom taking flight in panic, but it didn't stop rising at turkey height. It kept going, 6 feet, 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet, and then it stopped, fully erect, staring directly at me, 9 feet away, 9 goddamn feet away. My brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. The creature stood between 9.5 and 10 feet tall. Its legs were as wide as my shoulders. Its shoulders were as wide as my truck. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand that tall, and they sure as hell don't have shoulders like that. Its hair was brownish black, varying in length like a beaver or muskrat's coat. I could see occasional white hairs mixed in, particularly on its legs and massive shoulders. The hair on its chest seemed thinner, exposing darker skin beneath. We stared at each other. Time stopped. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. My finger instinctively moved toward my shotgun's trigger, though I hadn't even raised the weapon. What good would 0.0 buckshot do against something this size? I don't know why, maybe hunter's instinct, maybe pure stupidity, but I took one step forward. That was all it took. The creature turned and ran, not lumbered, not shambled, but ran, with speed that defied its massive size. It bolted down the draw, covering about 150 yards in what seemed like 5 or 6 seconds. Each footfall created a vibration I could feel through my boots. Boom, 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 like heavy construction equipment compacting dirt. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. Then just as suddenly as it had started running, it stopped. Completely still now, it stood at the bottom of the draw, partially obscured by morning fog and brush. My legs felt like concrete. My mouth was dry. I had my shotgun up now, though I don't remember raising it. The turkey I'd been pursuing was long forgotten. I took a deep breath and moved forward along the ridge, past where the creature had been standing. I needed to see better, to confirm what I'd just witnessed. The fog had lifted slightly with the rising sun, but visibility in the draw was still poor. That's when I heard it. The sound started low, then rose to a pitch that didn't seem possible. It was like a woman screaming, but mixed with something else, a vibration, like bass you feel at a concert when you're standing too close to the speakers. But there were no speakers out here, just woods and whatever this thing was. The scream continued, impossibly long. No human could hold a note that long without breathing. I reflexively shouldered my shotgun, pointing it toward the sound. As soon as I did, the scream changed. It transformed into a sound like asthmatic breathing, raspy, labored in and out. Then silence. Complete silence. Even the birds had stopped chirping. I stood there for I don't know how long. Minutes, maybe. My arms ached from holding the shotgun up. Eventually, I lowered it, my eyes still fixed on the spot where I'd last seen the creature. Something inside me, curiosity, disbelief, or just plain stubbornness, made me continue. I had to know. I moved carefully down toward the draw, my shotgun ready, every sense heightened to painful awareness. The morning had warmed enough that insects were buzzing now, the normal sounds of the woods returning gradually. At the bottom of the drawer, I found disturbed ground. Leaves and sticks pushed aside, moss compressed, and there, in a patch of soft mud, was a single footprint. I crouched down to examine it. The print was large, but not impossibly so, maybe size 14 or 15, like a really big person would leave. But this didn't match what I'd seen. The creature that stood before me should have left a print twice this size. I looked around for more tracks but found none. Just this single print that only deepened the mystery. The sun was fully up now. My watch read 7:22 a.m. Less than 2 hours had passed since I'd first heard that turkey gobble, but everything had changed. I stood up, suddenly aware of how exposed I felt in that drawer. The feeling of being watched prickled the back of my neck. I needed to get out of there. I took a different route back to my truck, avoiding the fallen oaks entirely. My mind raced the entire walk. What had I seen? A bear standing oddly? Some kind of escaped exotic animal? A man in some kind of costume? None of these explanations fit what I'd witnessed. When I reached my truck, I sat inside with the doors locked for several minutes, just breathing. My hands shook as I placed my shotgun in its case. I noticed I'd been gripping it so tightly that my fingers had left sweat marks on the woodstock. I started the engine but didn't drive away immediately. Instead, I took out my phone and opened the Notes app. I needed to record what happened while it was fresh. Date, time, location, descriptions, everything I could remember. Because I knew how this would sound to others. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. I drove home in a daze. The familiar roads of Greenville passed by without registration. When I pulled into my driveway, my wife came out onto the porch, probably surprised to see me back so early on opening day. "No luck?" she asked as I got out of the truck. I just shook my head. I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Not until I'd figured out what to say. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature standing up, impossibly tall against the morning sky. I heard that scream-turned breathing sound. I felt the vibration of its footsteps through the earth. The next day, I called my buddy Shane, who worked for the Department of Conservation. I tried to sound casual when I asked if there had been any unusual animal sightings in Wayne County recently. "Like what?" he asked. "I don't know. Anything out of the ordinary. Large predators, maybe?" "Well, we had a report of a mountain lion near Piedmont last month, but nothing confirmed. Why? You see something while turkey hunting?" I hesitated. Just thought I saw something unusual. Probably nothing. 2 days later, I returned to the property. I told myself it was to hunt turkey again, but the shotgun was just an excuse. I wanted answers. I parked in a different spot this time and approached the area from another direction. It took me longer to find the exact location. The woods looked different in full daylight than they do at dawn. When I finally found the fallen oaks, I stood there for a long time, just looking. In daylight, with birds singing and squirrels chattering, it was hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with what I'd experienced. I made my way down to the drawer where I'd found the footprint. Rain had fallen the previous night, washing away any evidence that might have remained. I searched the surrounding area for broken branches, hair samples, anything that might validate what I'd seen. Nothing. As I walked back to my truck that afternoon, I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, familiar but foreign at the same time. Like when you walk into your own house and know immediately that someone else has been there. In the weeks that followed, I did research, lots of it. I read about black bears in Missouri. The largest on record was nowhere near the size of what I saw. I looked into escaped exotic animals, into local legends, into scientific anomalies. I even reluctantly read about Bigfoot sightings, though I'd always dismissed such stories as nonsense. I found some accounts that matched elements of my experience. The height, the speed, the sound. People in rural areas across America had reported similar encounters, often while hunting or fishing. people with nothing to gain and credibility to lose by sharing their stories. I never told many people about what happened that morning. Those I did tell gave me the reactions I expected. Concerned looks, nervous laughter, suggestions that maybe I'd been more tired than I realized. My dad was the only one who didn't question me. He just listened, nodded and said, "There are things in these woods we don't understand, Travis. I still hunt that property. I still climb those hills before dawn and listen for gobbling turkeys. But I never go near those fallen oaks, and I never hunt alone anymore. Whatever stood before me that April morning in 2016 shouldn't exist according to science, according to logic, according to everything I thought I knew about the natural world. But it does exist. I saw it. I heard it. I felt it through the ground beneath my feet. And sometimes, when I'm driving home late and pass by those woods, I swear I can hear that sound again. That impossible scream that turns to breathing, carried on the wind from somewhere deep in the darkness.